Welcome to boring pastimes for sleep tonight. We'll travel backward through quiet centuries, through gardens and roads, workshops and kitchens, the slower corners of human history. These are not the tales of kings or wars. These are the smaller, steadier stories, the ones built from hands, patience, and repetition. You don't need to stay awake. Just let the voices of the past drift through, like candle smoke curling toward the ceiling. Settle in. Let your breathing match the rhythm of old labor, slow, constant, unhurried. Donegan. The mist still hangs over the gardens, low and pale, softening every outline until the stones seem to float. The Kūmara mounds, arranged in patient rows, looked like the breathing of the land itself, slow and steady. And before the first tool touches the ground, the gardeners speak. A karakia, a prayer, rises, not loudly, but like a murmur. The words are old, older than the fences or roads that would one day cross this land. They are not meant to command, but to align, to remind those who plant that their hands are part of something already alive. This was how the day began in the Kūmara gardens of the Māori. It can be tempting to think of religion and work as separate things, one done in temples, the other in fields. But in traditional Māori life, the line was almost invisible. The garden itself was a place of tapu, of sacred restriction. Certain acts could not be done there. Certain words could not be spoken, not out of fear, but because the garden was understood to hold life in potential, and life deserved order and respect. Those who tended the Kūmara were not simply farmers. They were katiaki, guardians of fertility. Their task was not to control the earth, but to maintain a relationship with it. When they lifted their digging sticks, they were careful to move evenly, rhythmically. Each mound was shaped the same way, each stone placed with intent. In this repetition, a quiet, meditative rhythm formed, one that echoed through hours, through seasons, through years. It was the rhythm of survival, disguised as calmness. Long before planting began, there was preparation. The soil was turned and dried, ashes were scattered from burned fern and seaweed, and sometimes sand was brought up from nearby beaches to lighten the ground. This practice, called Wenua Wakarite, or preparing the land, took weeks. The work was repetitive and physically slow, but that was part of its meaning. The ashes added not only minerals, but a spiritual cleansing, a neutralizing of tapu, transforming the raw earth into a place fit for new life. Ash, after all, was what remained when something had been burned away. It represented transition, a middle state between what was and what would be to mix. The ash into the soil was to acknowledge that renewal comes through endings, that even decay has a place in the cycle of nourishment. The work of the garden was organized carefully. Different people, different roles. Everyone knew their place. The tohunga, or priest, oversaw the spiritual aspect, determining when the season should begin, interpreting omens, ensuring that rituals were properly spoken. The rangatira, or chiefs, coordinated labor and decided which families would work, which plots. And then there were the workers, men and women together, who dug, carried, and planted. Children often watched, learning the correct way to handle the tubers, never to drop them, never to cut or bruise them. Each act of care was a small lesson in belonging. The Kūmara itself was seen as a link between Rongo Mdteen, the god of cultivated food, and the human world. To harm it carelessly would be a small sacrilege. To tend it properly was a form of gratitude. When the planting day came, usually in late spring, after the signs of frost had passed, it began not with tools, but with silence. A special Kūmara seed tuber was chosen, often from a store pit where the previous year's harvest had been carefully preserved. This tuber, called the tipu, carried both physical and spiritual continuity before it touched the soil. It might be held aloft while a karakia was spoken, calling on the ancestors who had carried the first Kūmara across the sea. The tohunga's voice was slow, each word measured, sometimes barely audible over the wind. Then the planting began, a single tuber at a time, pressed gently into the mound. No one hurried. The movements were careful, ceremonial, and yet practical. The work continued for hours, the quiet punctuated only by the sound of hands against soil. When the last tuber was placed, another karakia closed the day, a reminder that the work had now passed to the earth once planted. The gardens became tapu, restricted places. Strangers could not enter. Children were warned not to run or play among the mounds. Even within the community, only certain people were permitted to tend the crop. Why? Because the early growth stage was delicate, and disturbance could mean loss. But also because of the belief that the Kūmara, like any being, could be offended by neglect or noise. So the gardens were quiet places, almost like outdoor temples. If laughter was heard there, it was soft, respectful. If someone forgot and used coarse language, they might offer a small apology to the soil. This quietness was not solemnity for its own sake. It was a practical form of mindfulness. Centuries before that word existed, weeks passed. The shoots began to appear, green tendrils curling out of the soil, shy and soft. This was the time of vigilance. Weeds had to be pulled before they grew too strong. Each day, the gardeners walked the rows, bending low, eyes level with the ground. They noticed things others might not, the way a leaf curled differently, the faint dryness of a ridge, the presence of insect tracks on damp mornings. There were no written records, no notebooks or charts. Observation was the archive. Memory was the library. When a gardener spoke of the plants, it was with the tone of someone describing friends. They used gentle phrases, as though the crop were listening. Perhaps it was. Weather was not an external force, but a dialogue. Rain was welcomed, but too much could ruin the crop. Wind was good if it came softly, bad if it came from the south. To understand these nuances, Mbori gardeners watched the sky not for spectacle, but for instruction. They read the cloud formations, noting how quickly they moved and from which direction. They studied the color of light at dawn, the scent of the air at dusk when storms came. They covered the mounds with leaves or bracken. When frost threatened, they lit small fires nearby to drift smoke over the fields, a thin protective veil. All this effort for a plant that in other climates grew easily. But in Aotearoa, every successful season felt like an earned conversation with nature. As weeks turned to months, the Kūmara plants spread their vines across the mounds. Their leaves formed a dense, glossy carpet. The gardens became quiet oceans of green dot during this time. Social life adjusted around the work. Feasts were planned according to the rhythms of planting and weeding. Other tasks, fishing, tool-making, crafting filled the gaps between the crop's needs. The garden became a calendar you could walk through. You could tell the time of year, not by the stars alone, but by the height of the vines, the feel of the soil, the smell of sap when a leaf was broken. And so the Kūmara wove itself into the human sense of time. There was, however, one curious ritual, a ritual of taking dot sometimes. A rival tribe might perform what was called a symbolic stealing of the first Kūmara shoot from another group's garden. This act, half spiritual and half political, was not mere theft. It was a statement, a way to claim the mana or prestige of a successful crop, if done respectfully. It could be forgiven, even reciprocated. If done arrogantly, it could lead to conflict. This tradition shows how deeply the crop's success was tied to identity and reputation. The ability to grow Kūmara in a difficult land was proof of both wisdom and authority. In this sense, the plant was a quiet symbol of civilization, of patience, as power to imagine this world. You must picture the feel of it, the handle of the KO, polished smooth by years of hands, the texture of the soil, cool in morning shade, warm by midday, the small crackle of dried fern when laid across the mounds. No iron tools, no wheels, no beasts, just wood, stone, fiber, and time. When the KO struck a stone, the sound was soft and dull. When it lifted a clump of soil, you could smell the mineral breath of the land. These sensations were not distractions from the work, they were part of it. Every sound and scent told the gardener something about the soil's mood. In this way, the Kūmara gardens were not only sources of food, but schools of attention. After the vines spread, there was little left to do but wait. The gardeners checked occasionally, pulled a few weeds, ensured no birds or insects were nesting too near. Otherwise, the garden was left to itself. Waiting here was not idleness. It was a form of trust. People told stories while they waited, not of heroes or wars, but of seasons, winds, and harvests long past. Some stories began with the phrase, "In the time when the Kūmara first came, time stretched gently. The sun rose and fell, leaves grew, yellowed, and withered, and in the quiet darkness beneath the soil, the tubers swelled. When the time came to harvest, usually in the cooler months, another series of rituals began. But that is a tale of its own rhythm, its own ceremonies of gratitude and memory. For now, the gardeners stand at the edge of their fields in late summer. The vines are heavy, their color beginning to fade. The air smells faintly of dust and sweetness. They do not rush forward with digging sticks yet. They wait for a sign, perhaps a dream, perhaps a particular wind, perhaps the whisper of the tohunga that the season has turned. Because here, the measure of success is not in how much you take, but in how carefully you time your taking. And so they wait, as their ancestors did, as their descendants will. You are standing on the edge of a coastline that doesn't rush. It exhales mist into the morning, and the wind smells faintly of damp soil and seaweed. Somewhere inland, between the forest's edge and the river's turning, a group of people are stooping low to the earth. They are not in a hurry. Their work moves with the rhythm of their breath, quiet, patient, deliberate. They are tending to Kūmara, the sweet potato. And what they are doing on this cool and windy Aotearoa morning more than 6 centuries ago is something remarkable. though it would not look remarkable to you. It would look like weeding. The Kūmara did not grow here naturally. Its story begins far to the north, in tropical Polynesia, where the soil was warm, the sun heavy, and the plant grew quickly. Polynesian navigators, ancestors of the Māori, brought it southward in their great canoes across the wide Pacific. They carried not only tools and memory, but also the small, precious tubers of the plant itself, wrapped in leaves, stored in woven baskets, kept moist with care. The voyage was not just a migration of people, it was a migration of ecosystems. Each canoe, a floating garden. They brought with them taro, yam, gourds, dogs, and rats, along with Kūmara, their most temperamental companion. When the first Māori settlers reached Aotearoa, they found a land both generous and unforgiving. The forests were vast and damp. The birds were abundant. But the cold, the long winters of the southern islands, was a challenge that tropical crops could not easily survive. The Kūmara, in particular, protested. It was accustomed to long days and warm soil. Here, frost waited in the mornings. So, the people began to adapt over generations. Māori gardeners experimented patiently in a way that might seem boring to the restless. They studied the behavior of sunlight on their hillsides, the wind's path through valleys, the way stones retained warmth after dusk. They learned to build gardens that absorbed heat. These gardens, called Mara Kūmara, were carefully chosen patches of ground, often sloped, often north-facing. Stones were laid around the edges to catch and hold sunlight. The soil was loosened, mixed with sand, ash, and charcoal to keep it light and warm. In the far north, Kūmara could grow almost freely. In the south, it was a fragile experiment every year. Some seasons failed completely, and yet the people persisted, not through grand discoveries, but through incremental noticing. One elder might recall that a certain valley never frosted until late in the season. Another might notice that ash from burned bracken fern kept the soil dry and sweet. Over centuries, these small observations formed an unspoken science, a form of indigenous horticultural engineering as precise as any manual could be. No one recorded this knowledge on paper. It lived instead in ritual, in song, in the way one's hands were taught to sift the soil. When Kūmara was first planted in a new region, it was introduced, not merely placed. A ritual was performed to invite it to grow. These acts were not superstition. They were an extension of observation. Before planting, a karakia, a prayer or incantation, was spoken. The words varied from tribe to tribe, but the meaning was steady, a call to the earth, to the ancestors, to the plants themselves, acknowledging the relationship between human effort and natural response. The Kūmara was seen not as a passive crop, but as a guest with its own spirit, a being that required care and respect. You could not rush it. You could not shout around it. Even laughter was kept soft when planting began, believed to embody the fertility and nurturing strength of Papatranuku, the Earth Mother. Their hands turned the soil, gently pressing the tubers in, never stabbing or breaking the roots. It was said that the soil would remember the mood of those who planted it. If the people were calm and kind, the crop would grow peacefully. The physical act of planting was simple in description, but immense in labor. Rows were laid out by hand. The ground was turned using wooden digging sticks. Ko, sometimes tipped with stone or bone. There was no plow, no iron. The KO was pressed into the soil, lifted, pressed again. You can imagine the sound, a quiet thump, a small sigh of soil, and the slow, even breathing of people working in unison. When the mounds were ready, the Kūmara were placed not deep, but shallow enough to feel the warmth of the day. Over each row, a covering of bracken or ropra leaves was laid, to shield the soil from wind and frost. The gardeners moved carefully, methodically, as though the earth were a sleeping child. There were no machines, no beasts of burden, only rhythm and memory, and time. So much time, Mbori time, was not counted in months, but in signs. The arrival of the Kūmara planting season was marked by the appearance of Matariki, the cluster of stars known elsewhere as the Pleiades. When Matariki rose before dawn, it was a signal the new year had begun, and preparations for planting would soon follow. The people read the stars, the winds, the behavior of birds. If the stars were bright, the coming season was expected to be plentiful. If they were dim, it might be a time to store and ration. The Kūmara thus became a calendar crop, linking celestial cycles with earthly routines. It was a way of staying synchronized with the world, neither rushing nor resisting it in this way. Every planting season was a form of remembering, of where the ancestors had come from, and how the land must be spoken to before it gave anything back. Amara Kūmara was not just a field, it was a record of relationships between people, land, and spirit. Archaeologists today can still see their outlines in certain parts of New Zealand, low stone walls curving gently around rectangular plots, faint depressions where mounds once rose. To a modern eye, they look like nothing more than patterns of rocks in grass. But to those who tended them, they were maps of belonging. Each garden was known by name. Each plot had a lineage tied to a family or happer. Stories of good and bad seasons were passed down like genealogies, one elder might say. This mound gave the sweetest tubers in the year of the great wind. Another might remember that garden to the south, the one beside the river, it turned sour when the ash was too fresh. This oral memory was not just data, it was identity. The people did not separate themselves from their soil. They spoke of it as kin. In the southern regions, the Kūmara barely survived. Winters were long, and the plant's roots would rot if the soil stayed damp. Yet Mbori gardeners continued to coax life from it, season after season. They learned to store tubers in dry, dark pits, Rua Kūmara dug into hillsides and lined with fern or bark. The temperature stayed cool and steady. The air inside was dry. Each stored tuber was a small victory, proof that patience could outlast climate. Some of these storage pits still exist, sunken and moss-covered, quiet beneath pastures. They do not speak loudly of survival, but they whisper it in the same soft tones the wind makes across an empty field. And still, even as some regions abandon Kūmara for more forgiving foods, the memory of the plant's rituals remained. It was not just about feeding the body, but about feeding continuity, the rhythm between ancestors and descendants, soil and season. What seems ordinary in hindsight was, in truth, ingenious. Without iron tools, without written calendars, without the concept of temperature maps or soil acidity, Mbori communities achieved a delicate horticultural balance. in an environment that should have defeated a tropical crop. They succeeded not through force or innovation in the modern sense, but through listening to the land, the wind, and each other. That is why their story is best told slowly, because every act of survival here was quiet. Every adaptation was the result of a small noticing, repeated over generations until it became wisdom in the hum of their gardens. In the soft clink of stones warming in the sun, they built a form of sustainability far older than the word itself. As evening comes to the coastline again, the air cools. The gardeners gather their tools, leaving behind neat rows of earth. In the fading light, the stones gleam faintly, still holding the day's heat, a gentle promise that the Kūmara beneath them will dream through the night. Undisturbed, tomorrow they will return to check for frost, to whisper another karakia, to wait quietly for growth that no one can see yet. The sweet root has found a home in this cool land. But the question remains, how did these gardens become sacred places where work, prayer, and memory were one and the same? The vines have begun to fade. Their green has softened into yellow. Their stems lie slack across the mounds. Morning frost touches the leaves with a fine silver, and when the sun rises, the dew steams gently away. This is how the people know. It is time, not time as a number or date, time as a feeling. The Kūmara beneath the soil has finished its long, quiet work. The waiting is over. Before any digging starts, the Tohunga, the spiritual guide of the community, steps into the field. Their footsteps are careful, measured, as though they are walking through a sleeping house. A karakia is spoken again, this one a thanksgiving. The words are about gratitude and humility. Gratitude for what the earth has given. Humility for knowing it could have given nothing. Then, with the first shaft of sunlight touching the mounds, the digging sticks, the ko press into the soil. The sound is soft but full, the gentle break of earth after a season of patience. Each tuber is lifted with care, the soil brushed away by hand. The people move slowly, not wanting to bruise the skin of the Kūmara, which would shorten its life in storage. There is no rush. The harvest may take days. Each lifted tuber is examined, admired quietly, and placed in baskets woven from flax. Children help, learning not just technique but reverence, the way to hold the tuber as though it were fragile. Alive, the first few Kūmara lifted are not eaten. They are set aside, their place of honor clear. These are the first fruits, the koha tuatahi, the offering back to the earth, and to Rongo Mdt, the god of cultivated food. A small fire is lit. Steam rises into the sky. Sometimes a little of the first cooked Kūmara is returned to the soil. A gesture of balance, taking and giving in the same breath. Only after this offering can the rest of the harvest continue freely. The Tohunga gives the word, and the field fills with quiet energy, hands moving, baskets filling, laughter beginning to return. What was sacred now becomes communal. The work becomes lighter, easier. It is no longer just about survival. It is about celebration. By mid-afternoon, the smell of earth fills the air, sweet, mineral, unmistakable. Baskets of Kūmara line the garden edges, glistening faintly in the sun. They vary in color, pale cream, deep gold, and reddish hues that catch the light like slow fire. But the work is not yet done. Each tuber must be sorted. The best are chosen for storage, the slightly damaged ones for immediate eating, and a few of perfect shape and size are kept aside as seed tubers for the next year. Storage is itself a ritual. In the distance, small openings appear in the hillsides, the entrances to Rua Kūmara, storage pits carved from earth and lined with fern. They are cool, dry, and dark, built to protect the harvest through winter. Each tuber is carried into these chambers one by one, placed carefully on layers of dried leaves. Air flows through narrow vents. Moisture is kept out. When the door is closed, it feels like sealing away a secret. The Kūmara will sleep here until needed, a buried memory of the season's work. Once the harvest is secured, the gardens rest. The people turn from work to gathering to song, to storytelling, to repair of tools and homes. This is the time when travelers visit neighboring tribes, carrying baskets of Kūmara as gifts. A good harvest is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Feasts are held, often near the same gardens that only weeks before were silent with ritual. Now they are filled with the sound of voices and cooking fires. The Kūmara is roasted, boiled, mashed, each method with its own small traditions. Elders tell stories of seasons past, of ancestors who survived famines, of gardens that fed villages through lean years. These stories are not dramatic. They are steady, told with long pauses and low tones. Like the slow turning of soil through them, the people remember that every mound, every stone, every ash-mixed furrow is part of a longer continuity, one that stretches back to the first voyagers who brought the plant across the sea. In Mbori oratory, Kūmara appears often, not as a crop, but as a metaphor for humility. There is a proverb, Kabor, te Kūmara, e Carrero, Mortona, ake, Rika. The Kūmara does not speak of its own sweetness. It means true worth does not announce itself. The Kūmara grows underground, quietly, without display, and yet it sustains everyone. It is the model of modesty and purpose. In this way, the plant became a moral teacher. To be like the Kūmara was to work steadily, to be of service, to nourish others without pride. Perhaps that is why, even today, when modern agriculture and machinery have transformed landscapes, the image of the Kūmara still holds something sacred, a whisper of older patience. If you were to walk across certain valleys in the far north of Aotearoa today, you might still see the faint outlines of those ancient gardens. Low stone walls, slightly curved like ribs in the earth. Small terraces where the soil seems unnaturally even. Archaeologists call them prehistoric horticultural features. But to the descendants of those gardeners, they are footprints of ancestors, quiet evidence that human endurance once lived there. Each stone still warms in the sun, just as it did centuries ago. Each depression still holds water after rain, remembering the old hands that shaped it in this way. The landscape itself is an archive, not written in ink, but in patient work. The balance of plenty and loss, not every year, was generous. There were seasons when frost came too early, when rain rotted the mounds, when birds stripped the vines. In those years, survival depended on storage, on sharing, on memory. Some families would dig deep into the Rua Kūmara, counting what was left, planning, rationing with quiet resolve. There were no complaints. The belief was simple. The earth gives what it can, and humans must adapt to its mood. Even failure was folded into understanding. A poor crop became a lesson in timing, in soil care, in humility. The people did not curse the land. They spoke to it more gently, asking it to rest, to recover, and the next year they would begin again in that repetition. There was strength. Centuries later, when European ships began to arrive, bringing new tools and crops, many Māori communities still kept their Kūmara traditions, even as potatoes replaced it in some regions for practicality. The rituals of planting and offering continued, not always for the sake of food, but for the sake of memory. In the 19th century, visitors wrote of Māori women still beginning planting with karakia, still arranging mounds in perfect symmetry, still teaching children how to touch the tubers with respect. Change came, as it always does, but the pattern, the slow, deliberate pattern, remained beneath everything. The Kūmara had become not just sustenance, but identity. What then is the real story of the Kūmara? It is not only about gardening. It is about an ancient patience, the kind of patience that builds cultures quietly, one season at a time. The people who tended these gardens were not chasing glory or conquest. They were listening to stars, to soil, to seasons, to silence. Their work reminds us that civilization is not always built in stone or steel. Sometimes it is built in the steady rhythm of hands pressing roots into earth. In the act of trusting time itself. When the Kūmara was buried, it looked lifeless, but it was only waiting, storing energy, preparing for a return. Human lives are not so different. What we plant through care, patience, and memory may not show for years, but it endures. The sun sets low over the coastal hills. The harvested mounds lie smooth and bare now, dark against the fading light. Smoke from cooking fires rises in thin spirals. Voices carry on the wind, songs of thanks, of rest. A child holds a Kūmara in both hands, still warm from the earth. An elder shows how to place it carefully into a basket, how to treat even food as something sacred. The day cools. The first stars appear Matariki again, returning in its yearly arc, reminding everyone that the cycle never truly ends. Soon, the Rua Kūmara will be sealed. The gardens will sleep. And so will the people, tired but satisfied in the hush of evening. One might think the earth itself is breathing slowly. Remembering the story of the Kūmara is a story of adaptation through gentleness. It teaches that survival can be quiet, that mastery can look like patience. From Polynesia to from warm seas to cool hills, this small, stubborn root carried not just nourishment but wisdom. That life thrives where respect and observation meet, and in that truth lies a broader reflection that our own hurried age, with its constant noise and haste, might still learn something from those who once waited beside the soil. Listening to the language of frost and sun, the Kūmara sleeps again beneath the land it learned to love. Its sweetness remains unspoken, and perhaps that is the truest lesson of all. The most enduring gifts of history are the ones that whisper, not the ones that shout. Somewhere along the quiet banks of the river Tiber, the morning begins with mist. The sound of water slipping against mud is steady, almost lazy. In the distance, a few voices call out, men greeting each other not loudly, but with the calm of routine. These are the Figline workers, Roman brickmakers. Their task is simple in theory and eternal in practice: to gather earth, shape it, and harden it into something that will outlast them. The empire may stretch across continents, but its foundations, quite literally, begin here, in the mud. To most Romans, clay was ordinary, cheap, plentiful, everywhere. But to these men and women it was alive. They could tell, by the smell of wet soil or the grit between their fingers, whether the clay was right for brick. Too sandy, and the bricks would crumble. Too fine, and they would crack in the kiln. The best clay came from riverbeds and low valleys, slow-formed places, where water had lingered and deposited fine silt over centuries. It was gathered with wooden shovels, loaded into wicker baskets, and carried on shoulders to the figline. The brickworks. Each trip was short but endless. The same path, the same weight, the same smell of damp earth. There was no need for haste. Bricks, like seasons, could not be rushed. A figlina was part workshop. It looked less like a factory and more like a small village of smoke. Mud and slow movement at its heart stood the kiln, built of fired clay itself, a wide, domed furnace with narrow vents and blackened walls. Around it were open yards covered in rows of drying bricks, each laid out neatly in the sun like loaves of bread. Every figlina had its own rhythm. Some were owned by the state or the army, producing building materials for fortresses and baths. Others were private, small family operations that sold to local builders and architects. Wherever they stood, the air smelled the same: warm dust, charcoal, and the faint metallic temps of wet earth. A day at the figlina began with the clay. It was dumped into shallow pits and mixed with water, trampled by bare feet or stirred with long poles until smooth. There was laughter sometimes, the low, muddy sound of men and children joking while their feet sank ankle-deep in brown slurry. The work was heavy, but it was rhythmic once mixed. The clay was left to rest, just as bread dough rests, so that the water could settle evenly through it. Then came the molding. Wooden molds, open at the top, were placed on smooth ground. A handful of sand was sprinkled inside to prevent sticking. Then the clay was pressed in, firm but not forced, and the excess cut away with a wire or thin blade. Each mold was lifted carefully, revealing a perfect rectangle, damp and soft. The surface bore the faint imprint of fingers. Sometimes, before the clay dried, a mark would be pressed into it, a stamp showing who had made it. The name might belong to an emperor, a military unit, or the owner of the workshop. Centuries later, archaeologists would find these marks still legible: leg ex gemina or officina domitia, silent proof that even bricks have authors. After molding came the longest stage of all, drying. Bricks could not go straight into the kiln. If they did, trapped moisture would make them explode, so they were left to rest in the sun for weeks, sometimes months. Workers would turn them every few days, brush away dust, check for cracks. A summer shower might send everyone rushing to cover the yard with woven mats or reeds. When the rain stopped, the covers were lifted and the quiet resumed. There was no way to hurry this part. Even an impatient overseer knew that the bricks answered only to the weather. If you were to walk through a figlina at midday, you would hear very little. Not silence exactly, but a soft harmony of human and natural noises. The creak of wooden carts, the flap of linen drying cloths, the muffled thump of clay, dropped into molds. The low hum of voices talking about ordinary things. A wife's illness, a good harvest, the coming festival. Somewhere, water trickles into a mixing pit. Somewhere else, a dog barks at nothing in particular. It is a world of repetition, of small gestures done well. A worker could spend 20 years doing the same few motions, and yet each brick would still feel personal, slightly different in weight or edge. That was part of the beauty. Even in a vast empire, even under rulers who built monuments to eternity, the hands that shaped the empire's bones remained human, imperfect. And slow Rome was an empire of stone in its monuments, marble arches, granite columns, but underneath it all, holding it together invisibly, were bricks. The great baths of Caracalla, the aqueducts, the domes of villas and temples, all began with the labor of brickmakers, who would never see them finished. Their clay, shaped and fired, became the language of permanence, in a way. Each brick was a quiet contract between time and ambition. Human hands making something meant to outlast those very hands. Perhaps they never thought of it that way. To them, it was simply work. But the empire, without their patience, would have crumbled long before it reached its glory. By evening, the brickmakers washed their hands in the river. The water turned briefly brown as clay slipped away, returning to the current from which it came. The sun fell low over the drying fields, turning every row of bricks into small mirrors of gold and red. Smoke drifted from the kiln, thin, steady, almost like breath. Someone played a reed pipe nearby, not for ceremony, not for performance, just a tune to fill the air as daylight faded. The workers sat together, sharing bread and olives, talking about nothing important. They would sleep early, wake early, and repeat everything again tomorrow. Nothing changed, and yet everything they made became part of change, the slow construction of a world. If one were to hold a Roman brick today, a fragment dug from a ruin, chipped and weathered, it would still carry a fingerprint, a small ridge, a curve left by a thumb 2,000 years ago. That print is not famous. It has no name, but it is perhaps the most enduring evidence of all that the empire was built not by marble dreams, but by patient, steady labor in the mud. Every brick was a quiet declaration. We were here. We made this slowly. And that, in its way, is a kind of immortality, not carved in glory, but pressed in clay. By the time the clay had dried under the open sun for weeks, each brick had become a small promise of what it might someday be. It looked firm, but it was still fragile. A little moisture could return it to dust. And so began the most delicate stage of the brickmaker's craft, the firing. The process was not loud or dramatic. It was slow. It could take days, sometimes more than a week, and it required patience, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats. The kiln, or furnax lateraria, as the Romans called it, was more than a furnace. It was a creature that needed to breathe, eat, and rest. It had to be fed wood and air in the right balance. It could be angered by wind, by rain, or by careless haste. Each brickworks had its own kiln, often built and repaired by the same families for generations. The shape was always similar, a round or rectangular dome, walls made from the ghosts of older bricks. Its mouth open toward the prevailing wind. At the base were the fire chambers, narrow tunnels where bundles of wood were fed through. Above them lay the kiln floor, pierced by small holes so that heat could rise through to the upper chamber, where thousands of bricks were stacked in precise formation. The arrangement mattered. The oldest workers knew the pattern by heart, rows of bricks with gaps between them, allowing heat to flow evenly. A single, poorly placed brick could ruin dozens. There was a quiet reverence as they worked. Voices dropped near the kiln, as though it were a temple. Even the overseers spoke softly. When the stacking was done, the kiln waited. The workers gathered bundles of dry wood, olive branches, pine cones, scrub oak, anything that would burn steadily and long. There were no clocks to guide them, only instinct and the color of the sky. At dusk, when the air cooled, they began. A spark was coaxed into flame, and the first thin lines of smoke rose through the vents. The watchers would stay awake through the night. Their job was not just to feed the fire, but to listen to it. The crackle of wood told them how much moisture remained inside. The whistle through the flues told them whether air was flowing properly. Too much flame and the bricks might warp. Too little and the firing would fail entirely. The kiln had to be kept alive, never roaring, never dying. It was a long night's work. By morning the air around the figolina was hazy with woods. The workers' eyes were red, their faces streaked with soot, but they moved with quiet efficiency. Inside the kiln, invisible transformations were taking place. At about 600 degrees Celsius, the clay began to lose its last traces of water. At 800 degrees, new minerals formed, binding the particles together. By 900 degrees, the soft earth had turned into something wholly different, the beginning of stone. The Romans did not know the chemistry, but they knew the signs. The air vented from the kiln changed color, first white, then faintly blue. The bricks themselves, when glimpsed through the openings, glowed like embers, dull orange, alive to them. This was not magic, but a form of patience turned to permanence. Not everyone could tend a kiln. It was a position of quiet honor, one that required intuition. The prefectus, Figline, the kilnmaster, rarely spoke during firing. He would crouch near the vents, eyes half closed, hand held out to feel the breath of heat. He could tell, by touch alone, whether the fire was too hot or too weak. If the flame rose too sharply, he would order the vents narrowed with broken tiles. If the smoke turned thick and black, he would add dry reeds to quicken the burn. No instruments, no written record, only memory and rhythm. Every successful firing was a kind of song, performed without words, passed from one generation of workers to the next. Some of these masters were enslaved men, others were freedmen who had earned the right to direct labor. But in this space, class blurred. The kiln demanded respect from all. It rewarded no one who hurried. Firing took anywhere from 5 to 10 days, depending on the kiln's size and weather. The heat could not be constant. It had to rise slowly, then be maintained for a long, steady burn. Too fast, and the bricks would crack. Too slow, and they would never harden fully, so they watched. During those nights, workers slept in turns on straw mats near the kiln, listening to the dull, living hum of fire. They ate simple meals, coarse bread, figs, and a little wine. They talked in murmurs about other things, a sick child, an upcoming market, a story one had heard from a traveler about distant Britannia. When the flames quieted and the air shimmered with heat, one of them would say softly, "It's breathing evenly now." and the others would nod. It was a strange comfort that even a furnace could seem alive when the kiln had burned long enough. The fires were allowed to die. The vents were sealed with clay, and the structure was left to cool, not for hours, but for days. Even a single impatient opening could cause a collapse. This was the final test of endurance. The brickmakers had done everything, and now they could only wait. The kiln exhaled warmth long after the flames had gone. Its dome stayed red in the sun. Birds perched on the top, unbothered by the heat rising from the vents. Finally, the day would come when the master judged it ready. The clay seals were broken, and the first bricks were drawn out. If they rang clear when tapped, if their color was deep and even, the firing was a success. If they were cracked or dull, it meant weeks of labor lost. There were no second chances, only the promise to learn and try again. Every batch of bricks that survived the fire was marked. Some bore imperial seals, a small rectangle pressed into one corner, naming the workshop or the legion that had made it. The stamp was not vanity, it was accountability. Each figlina's reputation rested on its brick's strength. In some provinces, the empire even required stamped bricks for public buildings, so that any collapse or flaw could be traced back to its maker. A fired brick was more than material. It was evidence of labor done correctly, slowly and honestly. There was dignity in that, and for the workers who owned little else, it was a quiet legacy. Long after their names vanished, their marks would remain pressed into the bones of walls and aqueducts. At the end of a successful firing, the figlina smelled of smoke and baked earth. The workers' hands were darkened, their tunics stiff with dust. But there was satisfaction in their stillness. The newly made bricks were stacked in tidy towers, the color of dried blood or desert sand. They would cool for days before being loaded onto carts, bound for distant towns and cities. Some would become floors for Roman baths, warm underfoot from hidden fires. Some would line aqueducts, carrying water to the capital. Some would vanish into anonymous walls, holding up markets, or barracks, or homes. The men who made them would never see those places. Their reward was simpler, the knowledge that their patience had turned into something solid at night. When the kiln was finally dark, the figlina was strangely silent. The hum of the fire was gone, replaced by the soft chorus of insects and the far-off barking of dogs. For those who had tended the fire, the quiet felt vast. It was the sound of completion, or perhaps of exhaustion. They slept deeply, their dreams thick with smoke and light. In those dreams, the empire itself might have seemed made of fire, glowing, breathing, enduring. They could not know that centuries later, when Rome's grandeur had faded, their bricks would still lie intact beneath the ruins, to build something that lasts longer than memory, that was, perhaps, their truest craft. And yet, for all this care and fire, there remained one more step, the moment when these bricks left the figlina and began their long, slow journey across the empire. How were they moved? Who carried them? And what became of them once they reached the cities they would help build? The kiln was cold now. Its walls, blackened from years of smoke, stood quiet under a soft morning haze. Around it, the brick stacks waited tall, even, steady, like sentinels ready for duty. The workers rose early, as always. The air was crisp and dry. The faint smell of baked clay still lingered. Today, their task was no longer to shape or fire the bricks. It was to send them away. Each brick weighed nearly the same, around 6 to 8 Roman libbre, or about 2.5 kilograms. A single ox cart could carry perhaps 2,000 at once. Though the animals strained with every rut in the road, they were loaded carefully, row by row, with layers of straw between them to prevent chipping. It was slow work, the kind that could fill an entire day before a single cart rolled forward. The drivers Meliones checked their harnesses, their wheels, their ropes. They carried water, a pouch of salt meat, and sometimes a few figs for sweetness. Their routes were long and mostly unremarkable, dusty tracks through open countryside, past olive groves and vineyards, toward the nearest via the great Roman road. Nothing about this work seemed grand, and yet each turn of the wheel helped build the world. When the carts finally moved, the Figline grew still. Only the faint jingle of metal harness rings and the low creak of wood broke the morning quiet. The workers watched as the carts rolled away, slow, rhythmic, leaving ruts in the soft earth. They would return empty days later, and the cycle would begin again. Clay, mold, sun, fire, and patience. It was a rhythm that could have continued forever. Had history allowed, the roads of Rome were unlike anything before them, straight, disciplined, built from layers of gravel, sand, and stone. But beneath their engineering was something more subtle: maintenance, carried out by hands as steady as the brickmakers. As the oxen moved, the drivers would sometimes stop to rest near mile markers, carved stones standing like quiet witnesses every 1,000 paces. Each one named the distance to Rome, the center of everything. Travel was measured, but by where? How the wheels creaked, how the animals' shoulders ached, how much dust settled on the driver's hair at inns along the road. Mansionese travelers could find water, grain, and a place to sleep. The brick drivers rarely stayed long. Their cargo had no urgency, yet delay was costly. Every day lost meant walls unfinished somewhere, a bathhouse waiting for its arch, a warehouse missing its floor after days or weeks. The carts would finally reach the construction sites in towns, ports, or the great capital itself. The builders met them with quiet acknowledgement, marking off each load. In Rome, brick was everywhere. Even the marble facades of temples and palaces often hid humble brick beneath its pattern, regular and unseen. The opus latericium, as it was called, brickwork, was the hidden skeleton of magnificence. A worker unloading bricks at the baths of Trajan or the walls of Ostia might never have seen the sea before. He might pause, briefly, to watch a ship unload amphorae of oil or grain, and then back to work, stacking, measuring, spreading mortar with a rhythm learned from others before him. Each brick, baked weeks ago beside the Tiber, now had its place. The men who built with brick rarely spoke of beauty. They spoke of fit, of weight, of alignment. They measured by eye, adjusted by instinct. Their talk was of weather, wages, and the quality of lime in the mortar. And yet, when the sun set on their work, a new wall stood steady, unpretentious, meant to endure. In Rome's crowded districts, those walls rose close together, forming narrow lanes. Children would trace their fingers along the warm surfaces in summer, feeling the faint ridges of the maker's stamps, leg 2 AVG, tib, CL, Felix, PLVC, IVs, figliness. Few knew what the marks meant, but they were everywhere, on houses, baths, basilicas, and aqueducts, the quiet handwriting of thousands of unknown laborers. Not all bricks traveled by road. In the coastal provinces, they moved by river and sea. Flat-bottomed barges drifted down the Po, the Tiber, the Rhine, their decks stacked high with red tiles and bricks bound for harbors. The sailors who guided them knew every current, every shallow sandbank. Their work was as patient as that of the brickmakers, slow, precise, demanding. They waited for tides, read the wind, tied their loads with ropes of hemp. At night, when the boats moored near riverbanks, the water lapped softly against the cargo, cooling it after the day's heat. A full moon would paint the bricks pale, almost white, the same material that, in daylight, glowed the color of rust and sun, fire and water, earth and air when you think about it, as perhaps the brickmakers sometimes did. Watching their loads vanish down the road, their craft contained all the elements: clay from the earth, water to shape it, air to dry it, fire to harden it. It was the most complete of all labors, the kind that left no part of nature unused. And the product of this alchemy was permanence, not beauty that dazzled, but strength that endured. The walls they made stood against wind and rain, earthquakes and centuries. They were, in a sense, the empire's heartbeat, slow but steady. Centuries later, long after the emperor's names were forgotten, travelers walking among ruins would see their work. Bricks still fitted neatly together, mortar still holding the maker's stamp, faint but legible. They would see the outlines of baths, temples, villas, all reduced to fragments, yet strangely alive. It was not the emperors who had survived. It was the patience of workers. Each brick, resting upon another, whispered the same story, that time itself could be built, one handful of clay at a time. As evening fell on the Roman roads, the oxen trudged homeward with empty carts. The dust rose behind them, catching the fading light. Somewhere far away, another kill was being lit. Smoke curled up, thin and gray. Into the twilight, a child might be watching it, wondering what the men were doing in that smoky yard. He might grow up to mold clay himself, to feel its softness yield under his palms. And so the craft continued, unbroken, unhurried, eternal. If you were to walk today among the ruins of Rome, the crumbling baths, the half-buried villas, you could pick up a brick still warm with history. Run your fingers across it. Feel the faint stamp pressed into its surface. It is a signature made 2,000 years ago by someone who never imagined you would touch it. That brick has survived empires, storms, neglect, and time. And still it lies there, silent but unbroken. It asks nothing. It proves everything. That patience, more than power, is what truly endures. The orchard slept. Beneath a white, unbroken crust of frost, the roots waited, patient, uncomplaining, half-dreaming in the frozen earth. Above, the trees stood bare and skeletal, their twisted limbs black against a pale sky. It was the long stillness before life returned, just before dawn. The orchard keeper stepped out of his cottage, the door sighing softly as it closed. His boots sank slightly into the frozen mud. A thin mist clung to the ground, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from last night's fire. He carried a small basket and a pruning knife. though there was little to harvest. His task in winter was not one of abundance, but of care, to mend, to prepare, to wait. The trees, like old friends, needed only quiet attention. He moved among them slowly, touching the trunks as he passed, noting cracks in the bark or signs of rot. He worked by habit more than thought. The rhythm of his life had become the rhythm of the seasons: repair in winter, blossom in spring, shade in summer, harvest in autumn. Even in this deep cold, the orchard still remembered summer. If you pressed your ear to the bark, as old wives sometimes said you could, you might hear the faintest pulse of sap, a slow heartbeat beneath the wood. The keeper sometimes imagined it was true. When the frost lay thick and the wind hissed between the trees, he would stand still and listen, not expecting sound, but feeling presence. The memory of apples hung in the air like a ghost of sweetness. He could almost taste them: russet, pearmain, costard, each with its own faint perfume. Last autumn's barrels of cider now rested in the cool cellar, sealed and still. The orchard gave, then waited. That was its way inside the shed. Tools hung in quiet order: scythes, pruning hooks, spades, and wooden ladders darkened by years of use. Each one carried its own patina of effort: smooth handles where hands had worn them down, blades nicked and sharpened countless times in the dim light. The keeper sharpened his pruning knife with deliberate slowness. The scraping of stone against steel was steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. These were winter sounds: the rasp of the whetstone, the muffled thud of logs splitting in the hearth, the occasional call of a distant crow, invisible in the fog. No hurry. There never was. Fruit did not grow faster for the impatience of men. Stone walls enclosed the orchard, old, uneven, half covered in moss. They had been built generations ago, when the manor was young. Each spring, small ferns sprouted between the stones. In winter, frost traced delicate veins along their cracks. The walls kept out deer and rabbits, but they also held in warmth, creating a small world of its own. Inside, the air was always a little different, more still, more sheltered. Even the snow seemed to fall slower here. Some said orchards were enchanted places, halfway between wild land and cultivation, between nature and nurture. The keeper thought of them as something humbler, places where patience could be practiced. Without complaint, every tree in the orchard had a story. There was the gnarled pear tree that no longer bore fruit but still offered shade in summer. The crooked apple tree planted by his father, leaning slightly as if tired. The young saplings bound to stakes, trembling in the wind but learning to stand. He knew them all. He spoke to them without words, as one might to old animals. Sometimes, on still days, he read the faint marks carved into the bark, initials of past keepers, faded by weather but not forgotten. The orchard was, in a way, a record of time more faithful than any chronicle. Each ring inside each trunk told of droughts and rains, of mild winters and hard frosts. If the trees could speak, they would remember everything. As the sun rose weakly over the hills, its light touched the frost, turning it to glitter. The keeper began pruning, slow, deliberate cuts that seemed almost like gestures of tenderness. He trimmed away dead wood and frostbite, cutting just enough to let new growth come later. He gathered the branches in a pile and burned them in a small fire near the wall. The smoke rose pale and straight, carrying a faint smell of sweetness, applewood giving itself back to the air. When he rested, he leaned on his spade and watched the smoke drift upward until it thinned and vanished. It reminded him, perhaps, that nothing in the orchard ever truly ended. It only changed form. By noon, the frost had softened. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. He sat on a low stone and opened his simple meal: bread, cheese, and a single dried apple. He ate slowly, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who asks little from the world. Beyond the walls, he could hear faint bells from the village chapel. They sounded soft and distant, like memories rather than sounds. For a long time, he simply sat, watching sunlight shift through the bare branches, thinking of nothing in particular. It was, in its way, a kind of prayer. Beneath the surface, the roots waited. They did not sleep as people did. They merely slowed, drawing what little warmth the earth could give. Moles tunneled quietly nearby. Worms turned the soil in patient spirals. Frost cracked and healed again, and time passed unseen. In this hidden world, the orchard was already preparing for spring. It was a process too slow for the eye to notice, too gentle for sound, the faint stirrings of life rehearsing its return as the light faded. The keeper gathered his tools and returned them to the shed. He checked the cellar one last time: barrels sealed, apples stored, cider resting quietly. He closed the door and stood for a moment, looking out across the orchard as twilight deepened. The branches were motionless, etched black against a silver sky. Even in their stillness, they seemed to breathe. The day had been ordinary, like hundreds before it. But the orchard did not need novelty. It needed care and time and silence, things the keeper understood well. He turned toward home, boots crunching on the frozen path. Behind him, the orchard settled into sleep once more. The frost retreated one night without ceremony. When dawn came, the air was no longer sharp enough to bite the skin. The ground, long frozen into silence, began to breathe again, releasing the faint scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. In the softening light, the orchard seemed to awaken from its long sleep. It began quietly: a drip from a thawing branch, the slow creak of a tree stretching after stillness. Then a faint murmur, the first bees, dazed and slow, humming as they searched for early blossoms. The orchard keeper noticed it immediately. He paused at the gate, his breath a small cloud in the morning air, and listened. After months of silence, the return of even a single bee was a promise. He smiled, not broadly, but with that subdued satisfaction that belongs to those who have learned to wait for life to return at its own pace. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments: a patch of green moss brightening on a stone, a trickle of meltwater between roots, the first small leaves unfurling. The keeper began the slow work of preparing the soil. He loosened the earth around the roots with a wooden hoe, breaking the crust formed by winter frost. Each turn of the soil released the deep, damp smell of life beginning again. The task was neither quick nor difficult, but it demanded patience, the kind of patience learned through years of repeating the same gestures. He murmured quietly as he worked, half to himself, half to the trees. It was not a prayer exactly, but a rhythm of words and breath that matched the pace of his movement. Some orchard keepers called it the song of turning. Others called it simply habit. A few days later, the trees began to show the first signs of bloom. Tiny buds, white and pink, clustered along the branches like hesitant thoughts. When the sun warmed them, their scent carried softly across the orchard, a faint sweetness that called to the bees. The keeper watched as they arrived, one by one. They worked slowly at first, clumsy in the cool air, then with more certainty. He had always admired bees for their balance of industry and calm. They never seemed hurried. They moved as though time itself belonged to them. He sometimes thought of their flight as a kind of wisdom, knowing exactly when to linger and when to move on by midday. The orchard was alive with quiet movement. The bees traced invisible lines between blossoms, a living geometry drawn across the air. If you stood still long enough, you could almost imagine you could see the pattern, the way each visit, each pause, formed part of a design larger than sight. The keeper worked among them carefully, never disturbing their paths. He carried small bundles of straw and ash, scattering them near the base of certain trees to ward off early pests. The smell of ash mingled with the scent of blossom, creating a balance of sweetness and smoke that belonged only to this time of year. He did not hurry. No one who tended orchards ever did. Fruit trees, unlike grain or vegetables, taught a long kind of patience, the patience of years, sometimes decades. Inside the shed, the tools waited just as they had through the winter. But now their use changed. The pruning hook was put aside, and the watering ladle returned to its place near the rain barrel. The keeper oiled the hinges of the gate, swept out the dirt floor, and opened the shutters to the mild air. The sound of bees drifted through the open door. He left it that way. The orchard could come and go as it pleased. In one corner, a pot of early seedlings, small herbs meant for grafting, stretched toward the light. The keeper knelt to inspect them, his rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. He touched each stem as if greeting it personally as spring deepened. Children from the nearby village began to wander to the orchard's edge. They came shyly, drawn by curiosity and the promise of apples yet months away. The keeper rarely spoke much, but he never turned them away. He would show them how the buds formed in clusters, how bees carried the golden dust between flowers, how not all blossoms would bear fruit. He told them, in his slow way, that the trees knew what they could hold, they would shed what they could not. The children didn't always understand, but they listened, and when they left, their laughter echoed faintly between the trees. The orchard, for a moment, seemed younger. Then came the rain. Not the harsh winter storms, but a long, patient drizzle that blurred the edges of everything. The world grew soft and indistinct, sky and earth merging into a single tone of gray-green dot. The keeper worked in it regardless. The hood of his cloak darkened with moisture, and droplets gathered on his beard, but he paid them no mind. Rain was not an interruption. It was nourishment. He walked slowly from tree to tree, testing the soil with his boot, checking for pooling water that might drown the roots. The orchard, in the mist, felt infinite, each row fading into the next until direction itself seemed uncertain. It was in these moments, when everything blurred, that the keeper felt most at peace. He had no need for clear edges or sharp distinctions. Only growth, slow and unseen, mattered. Spring was generous but fickle. One night of frost could undo weeks of careful tending. Each dawn, The keeper checked the sky for signs, the way the air smelled, the color of the horizon, the behavior of the birds. If frost threatened, he would light small fires between the trees, letting smoke drift through the orchard. The haze clung low to the ground, keeping the chill from settling. It was an old practice, learned from older keepers before him. The fires looked strange at night, faint orange glows beneath a canopy of pale blossoms. Seen from the distance of the village, it looked almost like the orchard was dreaming aloud. When the rains passed and the last frosts retreated, the keeper walked the orchard at dusk. He carried no tools now, only a small lantern that swung gently in his hand. He watched the petals falling, slow as snowflakes, forming a soft carpet beneath the trees. The orchard was alive, but it was a quiet sort of life, not loud or urgent, but deliberate. He thought of how each petal, fallen and forgotten, would feed the soil, that would feed the roots, that would feed the fruit. Nothing was wasted here. Even beauty returned to usefulness. He smiled faintly at the thought, then turned toward home as the light dimmed and the bees fell silent in their hives. As you picture the orchard in full bloom, the gentle hum of bees, the drifting petals, the faint smell of damp earth, you might wonder how many unseen hands have tended the trees that feed us. How many quiet lives have passed between blossom and harvest, known only to the roots beneath our feet? The keeper could not have answered that. He only knew that his task, repeated year after year, connected him to all who had come before. Perhaps that was enough. The orchard slept beneath a white, unbroken crust of frost. The roots waited, patient, uncomplaining, half dreaming in the frozen earth. Above, the trees stood bare and skeletal, their twisted limbs black against a pale sky. It was not death. It was the long stillness before life returned, just before dawn. The orchard keeper stepped out of his cottage, the door sighing softly as it closed. His boots sank slightly into the frozen mud. A thin mist clung to the ground, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from last night's fire. He carried a small basket and a pruning knife, though there was little to harvest. His task in winter was not one of abundance, but of care, to mend, to prepare, to wait. The trees, like old friends, needed only quiet attention. He moved among them slowly, touching the trunks as he passed, noting cracks in the bark or signs of rot. He worked by habit more than thought. The rhythm of his life had become the rhythm of the seasons: repair in winter, blossom in spring, shade in summer, harvest in autumn. Even in this deep cold, the orchard still remembered summer. If you pressed your ear to the bark, as old wives sometimes said you could, you might hear the faintest pulse of sap, a slow heartbeat beneath the wood. The keeper sometimes imagined it was true. When the frost lay thick and the wind hissed between the trees, he would stand still and listen, not expecting sound, but feeling presence. The memory of apples hung in the air like a ghost of sweetness. He could almost taste them: russet, pearmain, custard, each with its own faint perfume. Last autumn's barrels of cider now rested in the cool cellar, sealed and still. The orchard gave, then waited. That was its way. Inside the shed, tools hung in quiet order: scythes, pruning hooks, spades, and wooden ladders darkened by years of use. Each one carried its own patina of effort, smooth handles where hands had worn them down, blades nicked and sharpened countless times in the dim light. The keeper sharpened his pruning knife with deliberate slowness. The scraping of stone against steel was steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. These were winter sounds, the rasp of the whetstone, the muffled thud of logs splitting in the hearth, the occasional call of a distant crow, invisible in the fog. No hurry. There never was. Fruit did not grow faster for the impatience of men. Stone walls enclosed the orchard, old, uneven, half-covered in moss. They had been built generations ago when the manor was young. Each spring, small ferns sprouted between the stones. In winter, frost traced delicate veins along their cracks. The walls kept out deer and rabbits, but they also held in warmth, creating a small world of its own. Inside, the air was always a little different, more still, more sheltered. Even the snow seemed to fall slower here. Some said orchards were enchanted places, halfway between wild land and cultivation, between nature and nurture. The keeper thought of them as something humbler, places where patience could be practiced. Without complaint, every tree in the orchard had a story. There was the gnarled pear tree that no longer bore fruit, but still offered shade in summer. The crooked apple tree planted by his father, leaning slightly as if tired. The young saplings bound to stakes, trembling in the wind, but learning to stand. He knew them all. He spoke to them without words, as one might to old animals. Sometimes, on still days, he read the faint marks carved into the bark, initials of past keepers. Faded by weather but not forgotten, the orchard was, in a way, a record of time more faithful than any chronicle. Each ring inside each trunk told of droughts and rains, of mild winters and hard frosts. If the trees could speak, they would remember everything. As the sun rose weakly over the hills, its light touched the frost, turning it to glitter. The keeper began pruning slow, deliberate cuts that seemed almost like gestures of tenderness. He trimmed away dead wood and frostbite, cutting just enough to let new growth come later. He gathered the branches in a pile and burned them in a small fire near the wall. The smoke rose pale and straight, carrying a faint smell of sweetness, applewood giving itself back to the air. When he rested, he leaned on his spade and watched the smoke drift upward until it thinned and vanished. It reminded him, perhaps, that nothing in the orchard ever truly ended. It only changed form. By noon, the frost had softened. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. He sat on a low stone and opened his simple meal, bread, cheese, and a single dried apple. He ate slowly, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who asks little from the world beyond the walls. He could hear faint bells from the village chapel. They sounded soft and distant, like memories rather than sounds. For a long time, he simply sat, watching sunlight shift through the bare branches, thinking of nothing in particular. It was, in its way, a kind of prayer. Beneath the surface, the roots waited. They did not sleep as people did. They merely slowed, drawing what little warmth the earth could give. Moles tunneled quietly nearby. Worms turned the soil in patient spirals. Frost cracked and healed again, and time passed unseen. In this hidden world, the orchard was already preparing for spring. It was a process too slow for the eye to notice, too gentle for sound, the faint stirrings of life rehearsing its return. As the light faded, The keeper gathered his tools and returned them to the shed. He checked the cellar one last time, barrels sealed, apples stored, cider resting quietly. He closed the door and stood for a moment, looking out across the orchard as twilight deepened. The branches were motionless, etched black against a silver sky. Even in their stillness, they seemed to breathe. The day had been ordinary, like hundreds before it. But the orchard did not need novelty. It needed care and time and silence. Things the keeper understood well. He turned toward home, boots crunching on the frozen path. Behind him, the orchard settled into sleep once more. The world began in whiteness. There was no horizon, no clear edge between earth and sky, only the endless sweep of snow, smooth and unbroken, as if the world had been erased and then redrawn in pale lines. The sound was softer than silence, a hush so deep that even the whisper of breath seemed too loud. This was the land of the Inuit hunter, a place where survival was not a conquest, but a conversation, quiet and constant, between human and ice. The morning that never truly brightens the sun lingered below the horizon, spilling only a faint blue glow that made the snow glimmer faintly. In this half-light, a man rose from his low snow house, an igloo built from blocks of packed frost, its dome glowing faintly from within like the inside of a pearl. Once spoken, vanished quickly into the air, swallowed by the cold. He wrapped his sealskin parka tightly and adjusted the hood lined with fox fur. Each layer of clothing had been made by hand, stitched from the lives of animals, softened by hours of chewing, scraping, and patience. Every stitch, every seam, was an act of endurance. The hunter checked his sled. The dogs stirred, lean, silent creatures with thick coats dusted in frost. Their breath steamed faintly as they rose, waiting for his call. The sound of runners on snow, he began to move. The sled creaked softly, the runners gliding over the snow with the faintest sigh. The dog's paws made a rhythmic whispering sound, steady as a heartbeat. The land did not change much as he traveled. The light deepened and faded, and the wind rose and fell. But the shape of the world remained the same, endless whiteness, endless patience. To outsiders, this might seem like emptiness, but to those who lived here, every small change was meaningful. A faint ridge in the snow, a glint of light on distant ice. The soft echo of cracking, each was a message, a sign to be read. The art of reading the snow. The hunter stopped at a ridge and knelt, his mittened hand brushing the snow's surface. He examined the texture, the way it had crusted on top, the softness beneath. He could tell, from years of doing so, how the wind had moved in the night, which direction it would take later, and whether the ice below was safe to cross. The snow was a living language. Its patterns spoke of storms, of animals, of the distant sea breathing beneath frozen cover. He could read it the way others might read a map or a prayer. When he stood again, he moved with quiet certainty. Each step was measured. There was no rush here, only survival, drawn out in long, deliberate strokes. The hidden warmth beneath the cold when midday came, though midday meant only a paler shade of blue across the sky. The hunter stopped to rest. He built a small shelter of snow blocks, a half-dome just large enough to shield him from the wind. Inside, it was still and faintly warm, the way a closed hand is warm inside its fist. He lit a tiny flame in a seal oil lamp, its smoke rising thin and straight. The flame was small, but in this world, small things mattered greatly. Its light shimmered against the snow walls, turning them translucent like carved ice crystal. He ate dried fish from a pouch, chewing slowly. Each bite was deliberate, not for pleasure, but for strength. When he finished, he let the lamp burn a little longer before extinguishing it with a puff of breath. Then he stepped outside, and the cold swallowed him again, the seal's breath by evening. He reached the edge of the sea ice, a plain of frozen water stretching to the horizon. Here, beneath the stillness, life moved. Seals swam through black water, surfacing at small breathing holes to draw air before vanishing again. The hunter moved toward one of these holes. It was marked by a faint ring of frost, the moisture from each exhale freezing at the surface. He crouched beside it, motionless. The dogs lay down behind him, silent, as if they, too, understood the ritual of waiting. The hunter's breath slowed. The cold pressed against him, but he did not move. He had learned, long ago, that stillness was stronger than endurance. You could not outlast the cold, only match its patience. Minutes passed, then hours. The world grew dim. Somewhere above, faint ribbons of light began to stir the aurora, green and pale, shifting like smoke across the sky. The hunter did not look up. He kept his eyes on the dark circle of water. When the seal came, it did so without sound. A dark head rose briefly, breath clouding in the air. The hunter moved once, quick, efficient, final. The silence resumed immediately, as though the world had merely exhaled. He worked by feel, not light, drawing the animal from the hole, whispering a word of thanks under his breath. The words were not prayer, exactly, but recognition that life here was shared, taken, and given in balance. The seal would feed his family for days, provide oil for lamps, sinew for thread, skin for warmth. Nothing would be wasted. The hunter's gratitude was quiet but complete. He wrapped the body in hide and lashed it to the sled above him. The northern lights danced brighter, now flickering like reflections on unseen water. They made no sound, but seemed to hum in the chest if one stood still long enough. He looked up finally, his breath silver in the air, and watched the sky for a while, not in awe, but in familiarity. He had seen this before, countless times, and yet it never felt ordinary. The lights belonged to the silence as much as to the heavens. The return across the ice, the journey home, was long, but the stars gave direction. Each one was a guidepost, known by name and position. The dogs trotted steadily, their breath keeping rhythm with his thoughts. He hummed a low tune, an old melody learned from his father, meant to steady the heart on long nights. It was less a song than a vibration in the throat, a way to feel company in the empty air as the land rose again. The faint glow of his family's snow house came into view, a dot of orange light in the vast white. The sight was ordinary, and yet it filled him with warmth that the cold could not reach. He slowed the sled and let the dogs rest. Snow crunched beneath their paws as they turned toward home inside the igloo. The air was thick with warmth and the smell of burning oil. His wife looked up from sewing a line of tiny, perfect stitches along a pair of mittens. His children stirred from their sleeping furs, blinking. The hunter laid the seal beside the doorway and nodded once. There were no exclamations, no loud joy, only soft contentment. The work was done, the day complete. They would eat, they would sleep, and tomorrow they would begin again outside. The aurora moved slowly across the sky, painting the ice in shades of green and violet. The dogs slept near the sled, the snow rising gently around them. In this quiet world, survival was never dramatic. It was made of small continuances, breath by breath, task by task, light by light. As the hunter drifted to sleep, he could hear the faint hiss of wind against the dome and the steady breathing of his family beside him. Each sound was proof of life, fragile, persistent, sufficient. The northern lights shimmered faintly through the snow roof, and for a moment, it seemed as if the sky itself bent close to listen. The Arctic did not reward noise or haste. It remembered only those who moved quietly enough to hear it breathe. The sea ice was never still. Even when it seemed solid, it moved slow and imperceptible, like the breathing of some enormous creature asleep beneath the world. Those who lived upon it learned to listen, not with their ears, but with the soles of their feet and the bones of their legs. The ice spoke in cracks and murmurs, in vibrations that traveled farther than sound could carry to the Inuit hunter. The ice was not a barrier. It was a road, a shifting highway laid down by winter, connecting islands, camps, and the wide mouth of the sea where seals and whales moved unseen. The morning, without footprints. The air inside the snow house was soft and faintly damp, warmed by bodies and the slow breath of the seal oil lamp. He rose without sound, careful not to disturb the sleeping forms beside him. When he stepped outside, his eyelashes froze together for a moment, and his breath turned instantly to mist. No new snow had fallen overnight, but the wind had reshaped what lay upon the ground. Dunes of drifted powder curved like ocean waves, pale and silent. Even his own tracks from the previous day had vanished. The world had reset itself overnight, blank once more. This was how life continued here, each day erasing the last, demanding that every journey begin anew. The long crossing he loaded the sled again. This time, not for hunting, but for travel. The family would move camp farther toward the edge of the sea, where spring would soon begin to whisper beneath the ice. He packed the sled with their lamp, the sealskin tent, and the rolled hides that served as bedding. The dogs watched, tails thumping softly, as if eager to resume their endless path. The snow creaked beneath their runners as they began. The dogs pulled with quiet energy, and the hunter ran beside the sled for the first stretch. Light-footed, despite the heavy fur clothing, the air was sharp enough to sting the throat, and every sound seemed suspended. Even the dogs' breathing felt subdued, absorbed by the vastness. Above them, the sun appeared briefly, low and pale, like a coin pressed against frosted glass. The horizon shimmered faintly where the ice met the sky, an illusion born from cold air-bending light. It made distance uncertain, a feature of this world where nothing remained quite as it seemed. Listening to the Esot midday, they paused to rest. The hunter crouched and pressed a gloved hand against the frozen surface. It was smooth, unbroken, but he could feel the faint pulse beneath, a tremor too deep to hear. The sea was restless below. He closed his eyes, listening. The sound or the sensation told him much. This section of ice was old, thick, layered from many seasons. It would hold them. But farther south, near the darker line where the water sometimes steamed faintly, the ice would be new and thin. It might shift without warning. He marked the safe line in his memory. No written maps were needed. Knowledge here was kept in the body, in the quiet recollection of movement, direction, and feeling. The camp by the edge, by the time they stopped again, the air had begun to change. It carried the faint scent of open water, salt, and minerals, the ghost of distant waves. The hunter built a low snow wall to block the wind and set up the sealskin tent behind it. His wife unpacked the lamp and scraped soot from its rim with a sliver of bone. His children helped gather blocks of snow to strengthen the shelter's base. This was not a hurried task. Everything was done with the calm rhythm of habit. Here, even small mistakes, a misplaced block, a crack in the lamp, could mean the loss of heat, of comfort, of safety. Precision was not a luxury. It was survival. As the camp settled into quiet, the hunter walked out onto the ice again, scanning the horizon for signs of seal holes and pressure ridges. The evening light dimmed into blue, and the northern lights began their slow ascent once more. The ritual of waiting. He chose his place carefully near a breathing hole shaped like a dark oval against the pale surface. He built a small screen of snow to hide his shape and sat behind it. The air was utterly still. Hours passed. Frost formed in his eyebrows, crystals glittering like tiny stars. The dog's shapes were distant shadows on the horizon. Time thinned until it became a single, unbroken moment. He remembered his father's voice, not loud, but steady, teaching him that the ice listened back. If one waited long enough, it would reveal what it held. Patience was not emptiness here. It was communication. The hunter could sense the sea moving below. The faint shifts in air pressure, the nearly imperceptible ripple that told him a seal was near. His body knew before his eyes did, and when the seal rose again, he moved with the same quiet precision, not as conquest, but as continuation. The seal's story that night, as his wife prepared the meat, the hunter worked quietly by the lamp's glow, softening sinew into thread. Each strand had to be teased apart carefully, rolled between the palms until smooth. The lamp flickered, casting small shadows across the snow walls. Outside, the aurora pulsed faintly, as if mirroring the rhythm of the sea below. The hunter spoke little, but his hands told stories in their work. Each cut and stitch was a memory of those who had taught him, of the unbroken line of patience stretching back generations. The seal he had taken was now part of that story, its life joining theirs in a cycle older than language. The family ate slowly, sharing silence as warmth. After the meal, they pressed close together beneath furs. The sounds of the outside world, muffled by snow, the wisdom of the quiet world. It was said among the elders that the ice itself could teach a person how to think, not through words, but through waiting. In this land, impulsive action brought danger. Haste broke things, sleds, plans, bones. To live here was to learn rhythm, the pace of wind, of ice, of hunger, of light, returning inch by inch after months of darkness. The hunter understood this deeply. When the world gave nothing, he gave nothing in return. When it opened, he moved. It was not philosophy. It was survival made into patience. Sometimes, outsiders described this life as lonely, but to the hunter, loneliness was a strange idea. He was never truly alone. There was the sound of the dog's breathing, the whisper of ice shifting, the faint hum of the lights above. Even the silence had texture layers of sound hidden within stillness. The sky that speaks late. One night, he woke suddenly. The lamp had burned low, and the air had cooled. He stepped outside to check the dogs and paused. The aurora filled the sky. It moved in wide, rippling curtains of green, violet, and white. The light shimmered across the snow, casting faint shadows that swayed like slow-moving tides. It looked alive, as though the world above were answering the world below. He stood for a long time, his breath steady, his heart quiet. He thought of how his ancestors might have stood in this same spot, under the same lights, centuries before. Nothing here truly changed, only the names of the people who waited beneath the sky. The lights dimmed gradually, leaving behind the deep blue of the night. He returned inside, the cold still clinging to his clothes, and lay back down beside his family. The silence closed around them again, protective and complete. To live on the ice was to understand time differently. There were no clocks, no rushing days, no sense of wasted hours. Every breath, every pause, every small act was part of the long conversation between people and their place. The hunter's world was one of endurance, but not suffering. It was a life shaped by waiting, waiting that was full, not empty. And within that waiting, there was wisdom older than history itself. The sea ice creaked softly outside, the slow voice of the deep beneath the frozen skin of the world. There was no single moment when the season changed. It came softly, gradually, a sound here, a scent there, a deeper shade of blue in the sky, a thin trickle of water beneath the ice, too faint to see, but unmistakable to those who listened. The hunter knew it was time. The cold still held the land, but the air had changed. The silence was no longer absolute. The world was beginning to wake. The first melt the snow underfoot no longer squeaked the same way. Each step left a darker print now, a wet trace that glistened faintly before freezing again. The dog's paws left softer impressions, and the sled's runners hissed as they moved, not across dry powder, but over damp, yielding crust. When the hunter knelt to test the ice, his glove came away damp. The sea beneath was breathing more quickly now, pushing up against its frozen ceiling. Soon the great sheets of ice would shift and crack, and the sound would echo for miles, like the earth stretching after a long sleep. The family began to prepare for the move inland, a rhythm as old as their stories. Each winter they followed the ice. Each spring they followed the melt. It was not migration in the usual sense, but an orbit circling the seasons in patient repetition, the work of dismantling inside the snow house. The warmth had become too much. Walls that once held firm now glistened in the lamplight, softening at the edges. Drops of water traced slow paths down the inner curves of snow, darkening the packed floor. It was time to take it apart. The hunter's wife began carefully removing the lampstones and folding the furs. The children helped carry gear to the sled, cooking pots, tools, bundles of sinew and hide. Even the dogs seemed to sense the change, restless, pacing. The hunter stepped outside and watched his shadow stretch across the snow. For months there had been no shadow, only dim twilight and auroral glow. Now the light was returning, enough to cast shape and direction again. The world, after its long half-dream, was beginning to remember itself. He lifted a block of snow from the roof and placed it aside. Then another. The air inside rushed out with a soft sigh, the breath of a home leaving its final warmth behind. The great cracking that night. The first great sound came, a deep, resonant crack that rolled beneath the ice like thunder. The family paused, listening. Then another came, farther away, and another, until the night hummed faintly with the sound of water breaking free. The dogs whined softly, but did not panic. They had heard this before. The hunter smiled slightly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. It was the same sound every year, the sea reclaiming itself by morning. Long dark lines had appeared across the white plain, marking where the ice had begun to split. Mist rose from these seams, carrying the smell of salt and life. It was a strange scent, sharp and alive after months of pure cold air. The hunter moved carefully now, steering the sled between these lines. To cross the wrong place would be to vanish into the black water beneath. But he knew the safe routes, by instinct, by memory, by the rhythm of the thaw, the return of water. They camped near the inlet, where the tide had begun to push through. The water gleamed black and silver, restless and full of sound. Chunks of ice drifted like slow-moving islands, bumping softly against one another. The dogs drank deeply, tongues lapping at meltwater pools, tails wagging faintly. The hunter set his traps along the thinning edge, small bone hooks tied with braided sinew. Fish would soon return, slender, quick, their silver scales flashing beneath the surface. The sea, once hidden, would soon feed them again. He watched the water and thought of all it had given, and all it had taken. Out here, nothing was truly owned, not the land, not the ice, not the light. Everything was borrowed for a season, and then returned. The songs of the thin, the evenings, as they sat by the lamp, the sounds of the thaw filled the air, dripping water, the low, hollow groan of ice shifting, the distant barking of seals. It was a music made of patience, breaking apart, a slow release. His wife hummed softly, an old tune, older than memory. It had no words, only the rhythm of waves and breathing. The children dozed beside her, their small faces flushed with warmth outside. The northern lights grew fainter now, their glow dimming as the longer days returned. Soon they would vanish entirely, lost to the brightness of summer. But for now they shimmered gently, pale and slow, as if reluctant to leave. The memory of winter before sleep. The hunter stepped outside once more. The air was softer now, still cold, but not cruel. The horizon was streaked with gold and rose where the sun had begun to rise again. Not just for moments, but for hours. He looked back at the place where their igloo had once stood. Now it was only a mound of melting snow, glistening under the low sun. By the next day, it would be gone completely, as though it had never existed. And yet, he could still feel it, the warmth of the walls, the glow of the lamp, the soft breathing of his family within. The memory lingered like the taste of smoke in fur, faint, enduring. He thought of how every winter left behind its traces, small grooves in the snow where sled runners had passed, the outline of a campfire ring, the scent of oil in the air. They were small things, but enough. In this world, enough was everything. The end of the silence. The ice cracked once more, a clean, ringing sound that seemed to echo forever. Then, finally, the first true wave lapped at the shore, a whisper of open sea returning after half a year beneath the frozen crust. The hunter stood and listened. The silence that had ruled the months of darkness was gone now, replaced by sound, gentle, constant, alive. He felt the wind shift, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. For a long moment he did not move. He simply watched the water glimmer and thought of how before long it would freeze again and the cycle would begin anew. The world did not change here in the way others imagined. It turned slowly, predictably, like a wheel. And in that slow turning was a kind of peace, the comfort of knowing that even in the harshest places, the pattern always returned. Closing reflection when the hunter finally turned back toward the camp. The sun had risen higher, pale and bright across the snowfields. The dogs stirred, and the faint smell of cooking drifted from the tent. He smiled once, not out of joy, but out of quiet understanding. Life here was never easy, never cruel, never simple. It was steady. It was endless. It was patient, and patience, in this world, was the greatest strength of all. The northern lights would fade, the ice would melt, and the silence would give way to the soft music of water. But the lesson of the long winter would remain, that endurance is not the absence of struggle, but the art of continuing gently. It began, as most things did in the countryside, with the soil. Dark, heavy earth that clung to boots and smelled faintly of rot. For the orchard keepers of medieval England, the ground was both burden and blessing, a thing to be coaxed rather than conquered, watched rather than hurried. In these quiet valleys and rolling hills, the orchards grew in silence. Rows of gnarled apple trees stretched across the land like crooked lines of scripture, their trunks scarred from years of pruning, their roots reaching deep into memory. The keepers mourning the bell from the nearby monastery rang faintly across the fields, slow, deliberate notes carried by mist. In a small cottage near the edge of the orchard, a man rose with the light. His name, recorded in a tax roll from the year 1378, was Thomas Otta Orchard, literally Thomas of the Orchard, a name so ordinary it might have belonged to hundreds like him. He was not noble, not a craftsman of fame or wealth, but a keeper of trees. His life was measured not in years, but in harvests. Each spring meant blossoms, each summer fruit, each autumn cider, and each winter pruning and waiting. He dressed in thick wool, worn smooth at the elbows, and stepped outside into the damp morning. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, and the sky was low, a pale lid over the valley. Before him stretched his work, the orchard, not large, perhaps 50 trees, planted by his father and tended now by his hands. The orchard's breath in early spring. The trees looked almost dead, their branches black and bare against the gray sky. But Thomas knew better. He pressed his thumb against the bark and found it soft beneath the surface, alive, still holding warmth from the roots below. The soil was slick beneath his boots. Earthworms wriggled in the furrows, tiny signs of health. He moved slowly, checking each tree as if greeting an old friend. Here, a patch of moss that needed scraping. There, a cracked branch that must be trimmed. The work was small and constant, requiring no rush. Every cut had to be made just right. Too deep and the tree would bleed sap. Too shallow and rot would take hold. This, Thomas thought, was the true art of orcharding, knowing when not to act. Patience, always patience. The tools of his trade beside a low stone wall stood a wooden bench, worn smooth by years of use. Upon it lay his tools, simple things, a curved knife, a pruning hook, a small hatchet. Each had been passed down, their edges kept sharp, not by wealth, but by care. Metal was precious. Iron tools were mended, not replaced. When the handle of his pruning knife cracked one winter, he bound it with twine and beeswax. Muttering a small prayer as he did, he would use that same knife for another decade before the blade finally broke. Every object in his life bore the marks of use, not decay, but continuity. The orchard, the tools, the man himself, all were shaped slowly by time and habit. The quiet of labor, there was no sound more ordinary or more sacred than the scrape of blade against bark. It was the music of maintenance, the heartbeat of the countryside. The wind moved through the bare branches, making them creak softly. In the distance, a crow called. Somewhere, a brook murmured beneath frost. These were the small noises that marked his day. He paused often, leaning on his staff, gazing across the land. To most, it was just another field, but to him, it was a living calendar. Each tree told a story, the dry one by the stream that always flowered late, the crooked one near the hill that produced sweeter apples after cold summers. The orchard was a book written in slow language, one only he could read, the monastic connection, the monks from the abbey across. The hill often came to buy apples for their cider. They brought their own barrels, heavy and dark, smelling faintly of oak and vinegar. The monks understood patience, too. Their work was prayer stretched across hours, their words repeated until they became rhythm. Thomas admired them for that. They seemed to share the same understanding that all worthwhile things, faith, fruit, and fermented drink, required waiting. One monk, Brother Elfric, often lingered in the orchard, asking quiet questions about grafting and pruning. Thomas would answer in his slow, deliberate way, showing how to join a young shoot to an older trunk, how to bind it with willow bark. He spoke little, but his hands explained everything. God's work is slow work, Brother Elfric once said. Thomas had nodded. So is the trees. The first blossoms when spring finally came in full, the orchard transformed. Tiny buds swelled at the tips of branches, soft pink and white, glowing faintly in the morning light. The air filled with the hum of bees, a low, constant vibration that made the world feel alive again. Thomas watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He knew not all blossoms would bear fruit. Many would fall with the first strong wind, but those that remained would ripen slowly, fed by rain, sun, and soil. He brushed a hand across one of the blooms and smiled faintly. It would be months before this would become something to eat, to store, to press into cider. But for now, it was enough simply to see it. The promise of the year ahead, the orchard, and the seasons the orchard did not belong to him, not truly. It belonged to time, to the cycle of frost and thaw, blossom and decay. His task was only to keep it in motion, to ensure that life continued as it always had, in that way. Thomas's life was a quiet kind of devotion. No glory, no wealth, no songs written of his work, only the slow satisfaction of watching trees grow, fruit ripen, and seasons turn dot. And yet, in these small, dull tasks, there was peace. The orchard asked nothing of him but care. It gave back everything: food, warmth, beauty, and the steady rhythm that guided his days. Sometimes, when the sun was low and the air smelled of soil and sap, he thought perhaps this was what heaven might be like: not golden, not bright, but endlessly patient. As dusk settled, the mist began to rise again, drifting low between the trees. The branches creaked gently in the wind, and the last bees vanished back into their hives. Thomas sat on the old bench, hands resting on his knees, and watched the world grow dim. The orchard, dark and silent now, was still full of life, unseen roots drinking from the earth, buds swelling in the night. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint drip of melting frost from a branch above him. Tomorrow would bring more work, more waiting, more tending, and he would do it all again, not out of duty, but because it was what the world required. The patience of trees was not unlike faith. Both asked for everything, and returned it slowly, season by season. By midsummer, the orchard had changed its color and sound. Gone were the bare branches of early spring. The trees now stood full and round, leaves dense enough to catch the sunlight and scatter it like coins across the grass below. The hum of bees was no longer gentle but constant, like the breath of the earth itself. The soil had dried and cracked in places. The air shimmered faintly above the orchard wall. The sky, a washed-out blue, felt heavy with waiting, the long, hot pause before the fruit began to ripen. Thomas moved more slowly these days. He carried a small basket with him for gathering herbs that grew wild among the tree roots: chamomile, nettle, and yarrow, plants that the monks had once said were good for the stomach or for sleep. He didn't think much of their medicine, but he trusted the way they smelled when steeped in hot water. The work of bees. The orchard's true laborers were not men, but bees. Thomas often paused to watch them, small, determined creatures, moving in clouds from blossom to blossom. He had learned, over years, to work beside them. They ignored him as long as he moved slowly, as long as his hands didn't shake the branches too roughly. He'd built their hives himself, wicker skeps coated in clay and ash, shaped like little domes. Inside, the bees built their combs in perfect order, golden, hexagonal, endless. Each hive was a small miracle. The monks from the abbey said the bees were symbols of divine harmony, creatures of perfect industry. Thomas wasn't sure about that. He thought they were simply patient, like the trees, like the earth. He'd once been stung on the lip while trying to lift a skep. His face had swelled for days, and he'd spoken little until it healed. But still, he admired them. They worked without complaint, and when autumn came, they shared what they'd made. The apple trees no longer looked like they were flowering. The blossoms had fallen, leaving behind tiny green nodules, the first shapes of fruit. Thomas walked the rows, counting them. It was a habit, not a need. He knew that not all of them would survive. The orchard was generous, but not forgiving. A storm could ruin a harvest. A cold night could blacken young fruit. Still, he counted them, murmuring numbers under his breath, marking in his mind which trees were strongest this year, in the cool shade beneath the branches. The world felt different, slowed down, muffled. Insects buzzed lazily in the tall grass. Birds darted from branch to branch, stealing worms from the soil. Thomas let them be. He understood that even the thieves had their place. Sometimes, When he pressed an ear against a trunk, he could almost hear the faint pulse within, sap rising. Slow as breath, cider, to the monks and to men like Thomas, was the great reward of patience. You could not rush an apple, nor could you rush the drink it made. The best cider, the monks said, was made from fruit that had fallen naturally, not plucked by hand. The fallen apples were bruised, imperfect, but their sweetness ran deeper. So Thomas waited. He cleaned the wooden press, scraped the old residue from its grooves, and repaired the cracked handle with a strip of boiled leather. He tested the barrels, listening for hollow sounds, patching leaks with pitch dot. Each small task was part of a larger rhythm, an unseen choreography that stretched across months. To rush one part was to ruin all the rest. The bees taught him that, to dot by midsummer. Travelers often passed through the valley, merchants with carts, pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, or messengers from nearby towns. They sometimes stopped by Thomas's orchard for shade or a drink of water. He had little to offer beyond that, perhaps a handful of dried apples, a few words. But the travelers always seemed grateful. One such man, a tanner from Winchester, had stopped to rest his horse under the largest tree. They spoke of weather first, always weather, then of work. When Thomas mentioned he'd been pruning the orchard since before the tanner was born, the man looked at the trees and said, "Seems slow work." Thomas nodded. "It is, but all the fast work ends too soon." The tanner laughed softly, then fell silent, as if the words had caught on something in his mind. The abbey had ordered cider again that year, more than before. Brother Elfric came one morning, his robe hitched above his ankles, carrying a small parchment with neat Latin writing. He explained the order in his careful, measured voice. They wanted 10 barrels by Michaelmas for trade with a neighboring priory. Thomas ran a thumb along the edge of the parchment. "That's near double last year." The monk nodded, smiling faintly. "God has given you more trees than you need. He will provide." Thomas looked over the orchard. The trees were still green, still heavy with fruit that had not yet ripened. He thought of storms, of rot, of wasps. He thought of all the ways a harvest could fail. Still, he nodded. "If the trees agree, you shall have your barrels." In late July, the rain came without warning. The sky blackened in the span of an hour, and the wind moved through the valley like a long, low howl. Branches whipped and cracked. Apples fell too early, scattered across the ground like small green stones. Thomas ran out into the storm, cloak whipping behind him, shouting though there was no one to hear. He gathered what he could, filling baskets with half-grown fruit, cursing softly at the wind. By nightfall, the rain had passed. The orchard was littered with damage, broken limbs, pools of water, bruised fruit. He walked between the trees with a lantern, his boots sinking into the mud. Each fallen apple was a small loss, each broken branch a wound. But even then, he did not despair. He had seen worse. He knew the trees would recover, given time. That night, he wrote a single line on a scrap of parchment. "Patience is the shape of survival." He didn't know why he wrote it, only that it felt true. By August, the air changed again. The orchard smelled faintly sweet, a mix of grass, earth, and fruit beginning to soften. The apples had taken on their colors, reds, golds, pale greens, flecked with brown dot. Thomas spent hours testing them, pressing his thumb gently into the skin, listening for the right sound when they dropped into his basket. He brought a few to the cottage, sliced them thin, and laid them out to dry. In the evenings, he'd chew the leathery pieces slowly, watching the sky fade to violet. Sometimes he thought of his father, who had planted the first trees. He remembered the way his hands had moved, slow, deliberate, careful. The same rhythm, the same patience, the same faith that the world would turn again next year. When the day was done and the air had cooled, Thomas would walk the rows one last time before sleep. The trees stood dark and still against the fading light, their branches heavy. Owls called from the woods beyond the wall. In the distance, the abbey bell rang one slow note for the end of the day. He stopped beside the crooked tree near the stream, the one that always bore the sweetest fruit. He placed his hand on its bark, feeling the roughness, the pulse beneath. All around him, life was happening quietly, sap moving, bees sleeping in their hives, the slow ripening that no one could see. Thomas smiled faintly. The world was slow, and that was how it should be. By the time the moon rose, the orchard was silver and silent. The fruit glowed faintly in the pale light, hanging like lanterns in the dark. Thomas knew the harvest would come soon, and with it, the long, hard work of pressing, fermenting, and storing. But tonight, there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting was, in its own way, a kind of labor. The trees waited. The bees waited. The man waited. Perhaps all of history, he thought, was made not by those who rushed, but by those who stayed still long enough to see things through. He turned toward home, the faint smell of apples following him through the dark. If you were to walk the roads of the Ottoman Empire in the mid-16th century, you might meet a man riding hard through the dust, cloak flapping, leather pouch at his side, a horse foaming at the mouth. He would not stop to greet you. He would not tell you his name. He carried something more precious than gold, time itself, wrapped in paper and sealed with wax. These were the couriers of the empire, the Uluk, the silent network that kept one of the largest realms on earth connected across mountains, deserts, and seas. They were the veins through which the empire's pulse flowed, not generals or not scholars or soldiers, but riders, scribes, and innkeepers who made messages move. Their lives were measured not in years, but in distances. The road between cities began at dawn in Edo, one of the empire's many administrative hearts. Mist hung over the fields. In a small courtyard beside a khan, a roadside inn for travelers, a courier named Halal adjusted the strap of his saddlebag and checked the wax seals of his letters. Each seal bore the tugra, the looping calligraphic signature of the Sultan, unmistakable, sacred, and untouchable. To break one without permission was treason. Halal had carried hundreds of them in his time, and yet, every morning, when he placed his hand upon the pouch, he whispered the same quiet prayer: "Let me arrive before the ink grows cold." His horse snorted softly in the chill air. Ahead of him stretched the Devlet Yolu, the road of the state, a vast chain of connected routes stretching from the Balkans to Anatolia, from Damascus to Baghdad. Along these roads, messages flowed like a river of ink. The station network every 30 or 40 kilometers. There was a relay post, a menzil, part stable, part fortress, part inn. There, couriers could exchange their tired horses for fresh ones. eat a bowl of lentils, or rest beneath rough wool blankets before riding on. Each menzel was marked by the same things: a flag bearing the Sultan's emblem, a stable boy half asleep in the straw, and the smell of leather, sweat, and boiled grain. Records from the time describe the system with bureaucratic precision. Each station logged its riders, horses, and hours of arrival. It was a masterpiece of organization, built on routine and patience. The empire's heartbeat was steady because men like Halal made sure it never missed a beat at the first station. He dismounted, signed the ledger with his mark, a simple crescent, and accepted a cup of watered yogurt. His next horse was ready within minutes. He didn't linger. A good courier never lingered. The letters themselves, most of the messages Halal carried, were not grand decrees or royal orders, but small, dull fragments of the empire's machinery, receipts for grain shipments, tax reports, instructions for repairing a bridge, lists of soldiers, rations. Yet each one was necessary. The Ottoman Empire was not sustained by sultans and swords alone, but by paperwork, endless, meticulous paperwork. Archivists in Istanbul recorded everything from the number of sheep in a village to the cost of repairing a bihas roof. Halal sometimes wondered if anyone ever read half of what he delivered, but that was not his concern. His task was movement. Meaning belonged to someone else. The weight of distance. By midday, the sun was high and the road shimmered. Dust clung to his face, his beard, his clothes. He rode with his head low, conserving water and strength. The empire was vast, stretching across 3 continents, and even the best riders could not cross it all. A message sent from Istanbul to Cairo might pass through 30 hands before arriving, each courier riding only a short leg before handing it to the next, and yet it worked. Like a long breath passed from man to man, the empire's words traveled faster than armies. Halal took pride in that thought. His life was small, yes, but it was part of something enormous and invisible. An encounter on the road near the edge of a plain, where scrub grass gave way to rolling hills. He met another rider, younger, weary, the horse stumbling slightly. They exchanged greetings briefly. The young man carried a sealed pouch marked with red wax. Urgent, from Bursa, he said, to the capital. Halal nodded. He could see the exhaustion in the boy's eyes, the cracked lips, the tremble in his hands. Rest at the next menzel, Halal advised. The keeper there owes me a favor. Tell him my name. The boy hesitated, then smiled faintly. You're Halal of Edirne. That's what they call me, though it's really the horse that does the work. They laughed softly, the brief, tired laughter of men who lived by the same dust and sun, and then parted without ceremony, each fading into the distance, the rhythm of hooves echoing across the plain, the bureaucracy of motion by evening. Halal reached a town where olive trees lined the road. He stopped at the post house to rest his horse and deliver a portion of his letters. Inside, a scribe sat at a low desk, surrounded by stacks of parchment. His ink-stained fingers moved quickly, copying entries from one ledger to another. He didn't look up when Halal entered, only muttered, "From Ed." Halal dropped the pouch on the desk. The scribe opened it, checked each seal, and nodded. 2 hours behind the record. Road was bad. Rain last night, Halal replied. The scribe wrote that down, too. Every deviation, every cause, every detail. Such was the empire. Even its delays were documented. Halal sat on a wooden bench, removed his boots, and stared at the wall for a long time. His whole life existed between destinations, between stamps, signatures, and changing horses. There was little rest in it, but much rhythm. The inn at night, that night, he stayed in the Khan. It was a simple place, a long room with a dirt floor, low beams, and a hearth burning olive wood. Around him, traders slept beside their goods, sacks of grain, coils of rope, baskets of figs. The smell of smoke and sweat hung thick in the air. Hillel lay on his blanket and listened to the night sounds, a dog barking outside, a horse shifting in the stable, the faint murmur of someone praying. He thought of home, though home was just a small room above a stable, in a dirt, with a wooden chest and a clay jug of water. He thought of his mother's orchard, now long gone. He wondered if anyone would remember the men who carried messages once the empire's roads grew silent. But such thoughts were dangerous for sleep. Better to focus on the next station, the next dawn, the next horse. Closing reflection outside, the moon rose over the road, pale, indifferent, eternal. The same moon hung over Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, the same light for 1,000 couriers riding through dust. Each carried a small piece of the empire's memory, a letter, a seal, a mark of ink. And though none of them would ever see the whole of what they served, their work made it possible for sultans to rule, for armies to move, for farmers to be paid, and for merchants to be taxed. Halil drifted to sleep to the creak of the rafters, his horse breathing softly nearby. Tomorrow would bring another road, another relay, another stretch of waiting and motion. And when he woke, he would ride again between orders and silences, between ink and dust, just another man holding the empire together, one hoofbeat at a time. When people imagine empires, they often picture thrones and battles, crowns and conquests. But the Ottoman Empire, like Rome before it, was held together, not by swords, but by roads, and not by emperors, but by clerks. These roads were not made for merchants or pilgrims, though both used them. They were the Sultan's roads, the great arteries of administration, lined with relay stations, guarded by decree, and mapped with obsessive precision. Every hoofprint, every delay, every broken seal became part of the empire's paperwork. It was, in its own way, a kind of slow magic, the magic of record-keeping, the Menzelhain system to carry a letter from Istanbul to Aleppo. More than 1,000 kilometers required not a single courier, but an entire chain of them, linked by the Menzelhain system. Each Menzelhain was a government station, part inn, part stable, part miniature bureaucracy. There were hundreds of these across the empire, spaced roughly a day's ride apart. They were marked by a crescent flag, a stable yard, and a wooden board listing distances: Istanbul, 132 menzels; Damascus, 52 menzels; Bursa, 17. The numbers were not miles or hours, but days, measured in fatigue and dust. The head of each station, the Menzel Amani, was both innkeeper and official. He kept ledgers that recorded the arrival and departure of couriers, the number of horses exchanged, and the time taken between posts. The ledgers were sent back to the capital every few months, where clerks in the imperial chancery examined them for efficiency. If one station fell behind, A note would be written in fine Arabic script, delay attributed to poor road conditions, Menzelkeeper warned. The courier's crudé rider's oath was simple: never rest when the seal is unbroken. Never break what bears the Sultan's mark. Never lie about the hour. Violating any of these could mean dismissal or worse, imprisonment. And so, couriers rode with a grim devotion, even through storms. Even when fevered or hungry, there are stories, perhaps half legend, of riders who froze in mountain passes, still clutching their sealed pouches. When their bodies were found days later, the letters were intact, dry, and unblemished. The empire continued, because even its dead obeyed procedure. A day at the station at Amenzil, outside Konya, an innkeeper named Yusuf ran his post with a kind of sleepy precision. He had been there for 22 years. Every day was the same: horses in, horses out, the steady rhythm of men who never stayed long enough to learn his name at sunrise. He walked the stables, inspecting hooves and feed. At noon, he checked his logbook. At dusk, he took his evening tea and counted the horses again. He did not see himself as part of history yet. In a sense, he was its custodian. Every empire needs its quiet keepers, those who record, check, and stamp what others forget. When a courier arrived, tired, dusty, and half-starved, Yusuf offered him lentil soup and a clean horse. Sometimes they spoke. Mostly they did not. But he always asked the same question: did the road treat you kindly? The couriers always answered the same way: it treated me as it treats everyone, without mercy. The bureaucracy of motion the Ottoman postal road was not swift by modern standards. A message could take weeks to cross Anatolia, months to reach Egypt. But what mattered was not speed, it was reliability. Every letter that left the capital was expected to arrive, sealed and logged, with an unbroken chain of handwriting connecting one station to the next. The imperial archives in Istanbul still contain thousands of these travelogues, long scrolls filled with neat, looping script. They record the smallest details: the name of a horse, the time of arrival, the reason for a missing saddle strap. Each line is a small heartbeat in the bureaucracy of empire. One document, dated 1583, lists the replacement of a single letter pouch whose strap had torn near Aleppo. The note concludes with a formal apology. The loss of a strap caused a delay of 1 hour. The courier expresses regret and resumes duty. Such was the gravity of a single hour. A courier's rest when Halal, our courier from Adorn, reached a larger city. He sometimes spent a few nights off duty. He would stable his horse, deliver his pouch to the local divan office, and walk through the markets like any traveler. He liked to watch the letter scribes at work. Men seated cross-legged under awnings, writing messages for the illiterate, love letters, petitions, complaints to the tax office, all written with care, then sealed with flour paste and folded with precision. Sometimes he wondered where those letters went, or whether they were ever answered in the evenings. He would sit at the public bathhouse, the hammam, and listen to other travelers talk. Merchants spoke of prices, soldiers of battles, scholars of poetry. Halal said little. His work was about silence, about carrying what others said, not saying anything himself. The empire in Incan Istanbul, the palace clerks, handled the culmination of all this movement. Their offices were quiet except for the sound of reeds scratching on paper. Ink-stained fingers, bowed heads, endless repetition. The empire's health could be read in these documents if the letters flowed smoothly. The realm was stable. If couriers were delayed or menzils fell silent, it meant unrest, rebellion, or plague. Even the Sultan himself, surrounded by splendor, relied on these dusty ledgers to understand his dominion. He could summon the names of every village, every tax collector, every rider who had ever borne his seal. The couriers might vanish into the road, but their handwriting never did. Closing Reflectione's night falls on the Menzel road. A courier rides through the dusk, his lantern swinging softly from the saddle. Behind him, the inn fades into darkness. Ahead, only the pale ribbon of road glimmers beneath the moon. The empire around him is vast, layered with faiths and languages and landscapes, but the courier's world is simple. It is measured in the space between dispatches, the distance between one seal and the next. When he delivers his last letter, no one will remember his name. Yet without him, the Sultan's word would never travel farther than his palace gates. Empires are not made of power alone. They are made of paper, ink, horses, and the patience of men who ride through the night, so that someone else's words may arrive at dawn. The first apples fell before dawn. Thomas heard them soft thuds against the damp grass, a small rhythm in the stillness outside his cottage. He rose before the bell from the abbey sounded and stepped into the mist, his breath faint in the cool air. The orchard was half hidden by fog. Each tree stood like a ghost in the white silence, branches heavy and glistening. When he brushed a hand along one dew gathered in his palm, cold and clean. Autumn had arrived, not with fanfare or frost, but with quiet surrender. It was time. The work of harvest was slow, patient, and heavy. There was no rushing it, not if one wanted good cider. Thomas began where the land dipped low near the stream, where the trees always ripened first. He gathered the fallen apples first, lifting them carefully to check for rot or wormhole. Those too bruised were set aside for livestock feed. The rest went into baskets, wicker, hand-woven, mended a dozen times. He moved steadily, never hurrying. The orchard, he believed, rewarded those who matched its pace. By mid-morning his back ached, but the baskets were full, green, red, gold, streaked with brown. The air smelled rich, sweet, faintly sour, the scent of fruit giving itself back to the earth. He worked until the fog lifted, and the crows began their calling from the treetops. The cider press stood under the open shed, its wood darkened by years of use. Thomas and his son, a quiet boy of perhaps 12, began the slow, rhythmic work of crushing. The apples were poured into the trough, their skins splitting under the weight of the stone screw. A thick, pulpy sound filled the shed. Juice ran down the grooves and gathered in the bucket below, pale and cloudy. The smell was sharp, a mix of sweetness and the faint sting of fermentation. Thomas dipped a finger into the juice, tasted, nodded. "Good fruit this year," he murmured. His son said nothing, only smiled faintly and turned the handle again. They worked through the day, stopping only when the light began to fade. The barrels filled one by one, each marked carefully with charcoal. Macdelmas, 1380. Cider making was a kind of faith, a trust in time, in hidden work. Once the barrels were sealed, The true labor began, the slow, invisible transformation of juice into drink. Thomas stacked the barrels in the cool darkness of the cellar beneath his cottage. The air down there was damp and smelled faintly of earth and oak. He placed a candle on a low shelf, its flame trembling in the draught. Fermentation, the monks said, was nature's quiet alchemy. Thomas thought it was something simpler, the world continuing its work without him. Bubbles would rise in the barrels for weeks, then slow, then stop. That was when the cider would be ready. He checked them daily, tapping the sides, listening for sound, feeling for warmth. Patience, again, always patience. When Brother Elfric returned, it was with 2 other monks and a small cart. Their robes were patched, their sandals wet from the road. They greeted Thomas with a nod, their faces soft with the kind of calm that comes from a life of repetition. He showed them the barrels, 10 of them, as promised. The monk ran a finger along one and smiled. "You have kept your word, as always." Thomas shrugged. "The trees kept it, not me." The monk chuckled. "Then God has blessed the trees." They loaded the barrels in silence, save for the soft grunt of effort and the squeak of the cart's wheels. Before leaving, Brother Elfric placed a small loaf of bread and a jar of honey on the table inside Thomas's cottage. "For your patience," he said. When they were gone, Thomas sat for a while, looking at the honey-thick amber made by his own bees, yet returned to him as a gift. It felt like a circle completing itself. Winter preparations, as the last of the fruit was gathered and the nights grew cold. The orchard entered its quiet season. Leaves fell in slow spirals, carpeting the ground in gold and brown. Thomas raked them into piles. The sound of the straw broomed soft and steady. He pruned the trees one last time before frost, trimming dead branches, sealing wounds with ash and clay. Each cut was an act of care, not to harm, but to prepare. His son watched, learning without words. Thomas explained only once, "You cut so the tree may rest, not so it may suffer." The boy nodded, and together they worked until dusk, cider and reflection when the first snow dusted the ground. Thomas opened one of the barrels. The cider had cleared to a soft golden hue, smelling faintly of apples and smoke. He poured a small cup, lifted it to the light, and took a slow sip. It was tart, strong, alive. It tasted of the orchard of soil, bees, rain, and waiting. He handed the cup to his son, who sipped and made a face at the sharpness. Thomas laughed softly. "You'll learn to like it." That night they sat by the fire, the cup between them, steam rising faintly in the dim light. The orchard outside slept beneath a thin frost, its roots deep, its patience deeper still. Memory in the soil years. Later, the orchard would outlive him. The trees would keep bearing fruit. The monks would keep brewing cider. His name, like his father's before him, would fade from memory, just another entry in a tax record, another keeper of trees. But the orchard would remember every pruning mark, every grafted limb, every fallen apple returned to the soil, all of it part of a slow, continuous story in time. The wood of the press would rot, the cottage crumble, and the abbey itself fall to ruin. But somewhere, in a quiet field, beneath grass and moss, a few roots would remain, waiting as they always had. The long patience of Tristemius once told Brother Elfric that he believed the trees prayed in their own way, not with words, but with endurance. They waded through storms, through drought, through frost. They bore fruit not because they were told to, but because that was what time required of them. He admired that kind of patience. In truth, he envied it. Men grew restless. Trees simply grew. That winter, when the snow came heavy and the air turned to glass, he stood at the edge of the orchard, watching the white gather on the branches. The world was still. The trees stood silent, unbroken, holding the weight without complaint. He thought, perhaps, that this endless patience was what it meant to be truly alive. Closing reflection centuries later, archaeologists digging in an English valley would find traces of an ancient orchard, faint impressions of planting rows. A few wooden tools preserved by luck and soil. No records named the man who tended them. No story recorded his days. But the earth remembered, as it always does. History, after all, is not only written in wars and crowns, but in slow, forgotten labors, in the tending of trees, the pressing of fruit, the quiet acts that keep the world alive. The orchard keepers of medieval England were not famous. They did not seek glory. They simply endured season by season, root by root, life by life. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what keeps history turning. Soft, closing soundscape, faint wind through bare branches, a trickle of melting snow, the quiet creak of a wooden barrel settling in the dark. When the courier's journey ended at the gates of the imperial city, his role dissolved into the larger stillness of bureaucracy. The road gave way to corridors. The hoofbeats of horses turned into the scratching of pens. And so began the slowest part of the journey, the long afterlife of every letter. Arrival at the gate of Felicitine's side the Topkapi Palace, where the Sultan held court. There existed an office more silent than any throne room, the imperial chancery, or Divanwai Humayun Kalimi. Few outside it ever entered. Its walls were lined with scrolls, ledgers, and boxes tied with silk cord. The air thick with the faint smell of ink and lamp oil. When a courier arrived at the capital gates, he dismounted, bowed to the guards, and presented his sealed pouch. It was inspected for tampering, logged, and handed to the chief scribe, who placed it on a small brass tray as if it were something sacred. From that moment, the letter was no longer a thing of the road. It was a thing of record. The courier, having ridden hundreds of miles, was dismissed with a single word: "May your road return." He would rest for a few days before being sent out again. His next dispatch, already waiting, sealed with the imperial tugra, elegant signature that was more artwork than autograph. The scribes sat cross-legged at low wooden desks. Each desk bore a small inkwell, a knife for cutting reeds, and a square of pumice for smoothing paper. Their garments were simple but spotless, their turbans wound in regulation folds. Silence was the rule. Conversation, if it happened at all, was whispered. A single letter might pass through 4 or 5 hands before it was copied, summarized, and archived. First came the reader, who opened and read it aloud in a level voice. Then the recorder, who summarized the contents into a report for the vizier. Then the archivist, who copied the original word for word onto a larger sheet, using an ink of walnut and soot that would not fade. Each step took time, and no one hurried. The slow pace was deliberate, an act of reverence toward the written word. For in the Ottoman worldview, Writing was not merely communication. It was a form of permanence, a trace that survived both messenger and message. The art of the tugravery official document bore the tugra, the imperial cipher. To draw, it required training, muscle memory, and spiritual focus. Scribes practiced for years before being allowed to reproduce it. Each stroke of the tugra was symbolic. The 3 vertical lines represented the Sultan's name, his father's name, and the word eternity. The curved loops stood for mercy and justice. The sweeping tail symbolized the extension of imperial power over rivers, mountains, deserts, and seas. It was said that a well-drawn tugra was like a prayer in ink, graceful, controlled, and patient. To rush, it was considered almost blasphemous, sometimes. When a courier's letter was particularly urgent, a scribe would stay awake all night drawing the tugra by candlelight, pausing every few minutes to let the ink dry, so the gold dust in the mixture would settle evenly. The glow of those candles could be seen through the lattice windows, flickering softly like stars in the palace courtyard. Paper and patience. The paper itself was a luxury. It was made from linen rags, pounded into pulp, pressed by hand, and dried in the sun. Before writing, the sheets were burnished smooth with agate stones until they gleamed. To touch such paper was to feel centuries of craft, the soft resistance beneath the pen, the faint whisper of fiber yielding to ink. Some letters were written on silk, others on parchment so thin it was nearly translucent, but all carried the same careful symmetry, a blend of mathematics and artistry that made even the dullest tax order look beautiful. A scribe might spend a full hour aligning the margins or measuring the spacing of lines. If a blot appeared, he would sand it gently with pumice, breathe on it, and begin again. The goal was not perfection, exactly, it was continuity. Each page had to look as though it belonged to the same unbroken hand, even if that hand had changed across generations. The archives of memory in a back hall of the chancery stood the Defterhane, or record vault. It was the empire's memory, a labyrinth of shelves, each stacked with ledgers wrapped in cloth. There were thousands of them, arranged by province, subject, and year. The oldest dated back to the early 1400s. The newest were still drying. Each ledger was tied with a string and tagged with a bone label written in Ottoman script, customs accounts of Aleppo, year 1589. To most people, these were unreadable curiosities. To the scribes, they were a living body, the pulse of the realm. When the empire expanded, new ledgers appeared. When wars ended, ledgers were closed and bound. When famine struck, notes were made in the margins, tiny human remarks. Rain failed, barley short, tax postponed. These details seem small, even boring, but centuries later, they are what allow historians to reconstruct how people lived, not the kings and generals, but the villagers and clerks who kept the empire breathing, one letter at a time. The scribes, evenings after the day's work. The scribes washed their hands and laid their pens on a small stand so the tips would not warp. They prayed the evening prayer, then gathered outside in the courtyard where jasmine grew. There they recited poetry. Some verses were about love, others about the weariness of endless writing. We dip our pens in night and draw the shape of silence. It was their way of finding beauty in monotony, of transforming tedium into art. the same patience that guided their hands guided their hearts. Sometimes an old scribe would read aloud from a faded letter, perhaps one written long ago by a courier who had since turned to dust. He would trace the signature with his fingertip and whisper, "Still legible. The ink remembers what we forget." The long sleep of paper in time. Even the scribes themselves faded from record. Their handwriting remains, but their names do not. The defters they wrote were sealed in chests, later moved to other cities as the empire's capital shifted, and finally to libraries and museums. Some have never been opened since the day they were bound. If you were to visit one today, say, in Istanbul's Bozbakanalik Osmanli Archive, you would still smell the faint aroma of lamp oil and age. The ink has browned, the paper has softened, but the script remains precise, delicate, unwavering. Each curve of Arabic and Ottoman Turkish letters still carries the calm of those who wrote by candlelight, believing that no word should ever be hurried. In a sense, the empire still speaks through them, not in decrees or proclamations, but in the quiet continuity of its handwriting. Closing. Reflections. Some histories are loud, told through battlefields and revolutions. Others whisper, written by men who spent their lives copying what others had already written. Yet, without the scribes of the Chancery, the Ottoman Empire would have vanished in its own complexity. They turned the chaos of empire into order, the noise of life into lines of ink. They believed that if something was written carefully enough, it might last forever, and perhaps they were right. Somewhere in a silent archive, a folded letter still lies beneath a layer of dust. It bears the tugra of a sultan, the seal of a courier, the signature of a forgotten scribe. The paper has yellowed, the wax has cracked, yet the message endures. The empire, in its slowest form, continues to whisper. When people imagine empires, they often picture thrones and battles, crowns and conquests. But the Ottoman Empire, like Rome before it, was held together, not by swords, but by roads, and not by emperors, but by clerks. These roads were not made for merchants or pilgrims, though both used them. They were the Sultan's roads, the great arteries of administration, lined with relay stations, guarded by decree, and mapped with obsessive precision. Every hoofprint, every delay, every broken seal became part of the empire's paperwork. It was, in its own way, a kind of slow magic, the magic of record-keeping, the Menzelhain system to carry a letter from Istanbul to Aleppo. More than 1,000 kilometers required not a single courier, but an entire chain of them, linked by the Menzelhain system. Each Menzelhain was a government station, part inn, part stable, part miniature bureaucracy. There were hundreds of these across the empire, spaced roughly a day's ride apart. They were marked by a crescent flag, a stable yard, and a wooden board listing distances: Istanbul, 132 menzels; Damascus, 52 menzels; Bursa, 17. The numbers were not miles or hours, but days, measured in fatigue and dust. The head of each station, the Menzel Amani, was both innkeeper and official. He kept ledgers that recorded the arrival and departure of couriers, the number of horses exchanged, and the time taken between posts. The ledgers were sent back to the capital every few months, where clerks in the imperial chancery examined them for efficiency. If one station fell behind, A note would be written in fine Arabic script, delay attributed to poor road conditions, Menzelkeeper warned. The courier's crudé rider's oath was simple: never rest when the seal is unbroken. Never break what bears the Sultan's mark. Never lie about the hour. Violating any of these could mean dismissal or worse, imprisonment. And so, couriers rode with a grim devotion, even through storms. Even when fevered or hungry, there are stories, perhaps half legend, of riders who froze in mountain passes, still clutching their sealed pouches. When their bodies were found days later, the letters were intact, dry, and unblemished. The empire continued, because even its dead obeyed procedure. A day at the station at a menzil, outside Konya, an innkeeper named Yusuf ran his post with a kind of sleepy precision. He had been there for 22 years. Every day was the same: horses in, horses out, the steady rhythm of men who never stayed long enough to learn his name at sunrise. He walked the stables, inspecting hooves and feed. At noon, he checked his logbook. At dusk, he took his evening tea and counted the horses again. He did not see himself as part of history yet. In a sense, he was its custodian. Every empire needs its quiet keepers, those who record, check, and stamp what others forget. When a courier arrived, tired, dusty, and half-starved, Yusuf offered him lentil soup and a clean horse. Sometimes they spoke. Mostly they did not. But he always asked the same question: did the road treat you kindly? The couriers always answered the same way: it treated me as it treats everyone, without mercy. The bureaucracy of motion the Ottoman postal road was not swift by modern standards. A message could take weeks to cross Anatolia, months to reach Egypt. But what mattered was not speed, it was reliability. Every letter that left the capital was expected to arrive, sealed and logged, with an unbroken chain of handwriting connecting one station to the next. The imperial archives in Istanbul still contain thousands of these travelogues, long scrolls filled with neat, looping script. They record the smallest details: the name of a horse, the time of arrival, the reason for a missing saddle strap. Each line is a small heartbeat in the bureaucracy of empire. One document, dated 1583, lists the replacement of a single letter pouch whose strap had torn near Aleppo. The note concludes with a formal apology. The loss of a strap caused a delay of 1 hour. The courier expresses regret and resumes duty. Such was the gravity of a single hour. A courier's rest when Halal, our courier from Adorn, reached a larger city. He sometimes spent a few nights off duty. He would stable his horse, deliver his pouch to the local divan office, and walk through the markets like any traveler. He liked to watch the letter scribes at work. Men seated cross-legged under awnings, writing messages for the illiterate, love letters, petitions, complaints to the tax office, all written with care, then sealed with flour paste and folded with precision. Sometimes he wondered where those letters went, or whether they were ever answered in the evenings. He would sit at the public bathhouse, the hammam, and listen to other travelers talk. Merchants spoke of prices, soldiers of battles, scholars of poetry. Halal said little. His work was about silence, about carrying what others said, not saying anything himself. The empire in Incan Istanbul, the palace clerks, handled the culmination of all this movement. Their offices were quiet except for the sound of reeds scratching on paper. Ink-stained fingers, bowed heads, endless repetition. The empire's health could be read in these documents if the letters flowed smoothly. The realm was stable. If couriers were delayed or menzils fell silent, it meant unrest, rebellion, or plague. Even the Sultan himself, surrounded by splendor, relied on these dusty ledgers to understand his dominion. He could summon the names of every village, every tax collector, every rider who had ever borne his seal. The couriers might vanish into the road, but their handwriting never did. Closing Reflectione's night falls on the Menzel road. A courier rides through the dusk, his lantern swinging softly from the saddle. Behind him, the inn fades into darkness. Ahead, only the pale ribbon of road glimmers beneath the moon. The empire around him is vast, layered with faiths and languages and landscapes, but the courier's world is simple. It is measured in the space between dispatches, the distance between one seal and the next. When he delivers his last letter, no one will remember his name. Yet without him, the Sultan's word would never travel farther than his palace gates. Empires are not made of power alone. They are made of paper, ink, horses, and the patience of men who ride through the night, so that someone else's words may arrive at dawn. There was no single moment when the season changed. It came softly, gradually, a sound here, a scent there, a deeper shade of blue in the sky, a thin trickle of water beneath the ice, too faint to see, but unmistakable to those who listened. The hunter knew it was time. The cold still held the land, but the air had changed. The silence was no longer absolute. The world was beginning to wake. The first melt the snow underfoot no longer squeaked the same way. Each step left a darker print now, a wet trace that glistened faintly before freezing again. The dog's paws left softer impressions, and the sled's runners hissed as they moved, not across dry powder, but over damp, yielding crust. When the hunter knelt to test the ice, his glove came away damp. The sea beneath was breathing more quickly now, pushing up against its frozen ceiling. Soon the great sheets of ice would shift and crack, and the sound would echo for miles, like the earth stretching after a long sleep. The family began to prepare for the move inland, a rhythm as old as their stories. Each winter they followed the ice. Each spring they followed the melt. It was not migration in the usual sense, but an orbit circling the seasons in patient repetition, the work of dismantling inside the snow house. The warmth had become too much. Walls that once held firm now glistened in the lamplight, softening at the edges. Drops of water traced slow paths down the inner curves of snow, darkening the packed floor. It was time to take it apart. The hunter's wife began carefully removing the lampstones and folding the furs. The children helped carry gear to the sled, cooking pots, tools, bundles of sinew and hide. Even the dogs seemed to sense the change, restless, pacing. The hunter stepped outside and watched his shadow stretch across the snow. For months there had been no shadow, only dim twilight and auroral glow. Now the light was returning, enough to cast shape and direction again. The world, after its long half-dream, was beginning to remember itself. He lifted a block of snow from the roof and placed it aside. Then another. The air inside rushed out with a soft sigh the breath of a home leaving its final warmth behind. The great cracking that night. The first great sound came, a deep, resonant crack that rolled beneath the ice like thunder. The family paused, listening. Then another came, farther away, and another, until the night hummed faintly with the sound of water breaking free. The dogs whined softly, but did not panic. They had heard this before. The hunter smiled slightly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. It was the same sound every year, the sea reclaiming itself by morning. Long dark lines had appeared across the white plain, marking where the ice had begun to split. Mist rose from these seams, carrying the smell of salt and life. It was a strange scent, sharp and alive after months of pure cold air. The hunter moved carefully now, steering the sled between these lines. To cross the wrong place would be to vanish into the black water beneath. But he knew the safe routes, by instinct, by memory, by the rhythm of the thaw, the return of water. They camped near the inlet, where the tide had begun to push through. The water gleamed black and silver, restless and full of sound. Chunks of ice drifted like slow-moving islands, bumping softly against one another. The dogs drank deeply, tongues lapping at meltwater pools, tails wagging faintly. The hunter set his traps along the thinning edge, small bone hooks tied with braided sinew. Fish would soon return, slender, quick, their silver scales flashing beneath the surface. The sea, once hidden, would soon feed them again. He watched the water and thought of all it had given, and all it had taken. Out here, nothing was truly owned, not the land, not the ice, not the light. Everything was borrowed for a season, and then returned. The songs of the thin, the evenings, as they sat by the lamp, the sounds of the thaw filled the air, dripping water, the low, hollow groan of ice shifting, the distant barking of seals. It was a music made of patience, breaking apart, a slow release. His wife hummed softly, an old tune, older than memory. It had no words, only the rhythm of waves and breathing. The children dozed beside her, their small faces flushed with warmth outside. The northern lights grew fainter now, their glow dimming as the longer days returned. Soon they would vanish entirely, lost to the brightness of summer. But for now they shimmered gently, pale and slow, as if reluctant to leave. The memory of winter before sleep. The hunter stepped outside once more. The air was softer now, still cold, but not cruel. The horizon was streaked with gold and rose where the sun had begun to rise again. Not just for moments, but for hours. He looked back at the place where their igloo had once stood. Now it was only a mound of melting snow, glistening under the low sun. By the next day, it would be gone completely, as though it had never existed. And yet, he could still feel it, the warmth of the walls, the glow of the lamp, the soft breathing of his family within. The memory lingered like the taste of smoke in fur, faint, enduring. He thought of how every winter left behind its traces, small grooves in the snow where sled runners had passed, the outline of a campfire ring, the scent of oil in the air. They were small things, but enough. In this world, enough was everything. The end of the silence. The ice cracked once more, a clean, ringing sound that seemed to echo forever. Then, finally, the first true wave lapped at the shore, a whisper of open sea returning after half a year beneath the frozen crust. The hunter stood and listened. The silence that had ruled the months of darkness was gone now, replaced by sound, gentle, constant, alive. He felt the wind shift, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. For a long moment he did not move. He simply watched the water glimmer and thought of how before long it would freeze again and the cycle would begin anew. The world did not change here in the way others imagined. It turned slowly, predictably, like a wheel. And in that slow turning was a kind of peace, the comfort of knowing that even in the harshest places, the pattern always returned. Closing reflection when the hunter finally turned back toward the camp. The sun had risen higher, pale and bright across the snowfields. The dogs stirred, and the faint smell of cooking drifted from the tent. He smiled once, not out of joy, but out of quiet understanding. Life here was never easy, never cruel, never simple. It was steady. It was endless. It was patient, and patience, in this world, was the greatest strength of all. The northern lights would fade, the ice would melt, and the silence would give way to the soft music of water. But the lesson of the long winter would remain, that endurance is not the absence of struggle, but the art of continuing gently. If you're still awake, let your mind drift the way old dust drifts in candlelight. And if you've already fallen asleep, that's perfectly fine. The stories have done their work, wrapping the past around you like a soft, worn blanket. Until next time, rest well among the slow hours of history.